The galaxy's ancient past holds secrets that dwarf the concerns of the current age, and among the most significant of these mysteries lies the origin of the Aeldari race. Long before humanity first gazed upon the stars, before the Emperor walked among mortals, and before the Great Crusade carved its path across the void, the Aeldari emerged as one of the most remarkable creations of the Old Ones during the cataclysmic period known as the War in Heaven. The Old Ones, those enigmatic beings who shaped the galaxy's early development, possessed knowledge and power that remains unmatched even by the standards of the 41st millennium. When the Necron tier, driven by their hatred of mortality and their envy of the Old Ones' longevity, allied themselves with the star gods known as the Khatan, the resulting conflict threatened to tear reality itself apart. The War in Heaven was not merely a struggle between two civilizations, but a fundamental battle for the very nature of existence in the material universe. Recognizing the existential threat posed by the Necrons and their Khatan masters, the Old Ones embarked upon an ambitious program of biological and psychic engineering. They sought to create warrior races capable of wielding the warp as a weapon against their enemies, beings who could harness the immaterial realm's power while maintaining their connection to the physical universe. The Aeldari represented perhaps their greatest success in this endeavor, a species designed from the ground up to serve as psychic warriors in the cosmic war that raged across the galaxy. The Aeldari's creation was not a simple matter of genetic manipulation, but rather a complex process that involved the careful integration of psychic potential into their very essence. Unlike the crude augmentations that would characterize later attempts at creating psychic beings, the Old Ones' work on the Aeldari was elegant and sophisticated. They crafted a race whose souls burned brightly in the warp, whose minds could navigate the currents of the immaterial realm with an intuitive understanding that other species would require millennia to develop. The physical form of the early Aeldari reflected their intended purpose as warriors and psychic conduits. Their tall, lithe frames possessed a natural grace that would later become legendary, while their elongated skulls housed brains capable of processing psychic energies with remarkable efficiency. Their sensory organs were enhanced beyond baseline parameters, allowing them to perceive not only the material world with extraordinary clarity, but also the subtle fluctuations and currents of warp energy that surrounded all living beings. The psychic awakening of the Aeldari race occurred gradually, guided by the Old Ones' careful manipulation of their genetic structure and spiritual development. Unlike the violent and often fatal psychic emergences that would plague other species in later millennia, the Aeldari's psychic abilities manifested as a natural extension of their consciousness. Their minds expanded to encompass multiple layers of perception, allowing them to simultaneously exist in the material realm while maintaining awareness of the warp's deeper currents. This psychic evolution was not uniform across all Aeldari, but rather manifested in diverse ways that would later influence their society's development. Some individuals demonstrated remarkable prescient abilities, capable of perceiving potential futures with startling accuracy. Others showed exceptional talent for manipulating matter and energy through focused will, while still others developed the capacity to commune directly with the warp entities that dwelt in the immaterial realm's depths. The Old Ones' enhancement of the Aeldari extended beyond mere psychic potential to encompass their fundamental relationship with the warp itself. They engineered the race to possess souls that burned with particular intensity, creating beings whose spiritual essence could serve as both weapon and shield in the psychic warfare that characterized the War in Heaven. This enhancement came with both tremendous benefits and inherent dangers, as the Aeldari's bright souls made them natural targets for the predatory entities that lurked in the warp's darker regions. Throughout the War in Heaven, the Aeldari served their creators with distinction, wielding powers that could reshape reality on a localized scale, and striking at Necron forces with weapons that bypassed conventional defenses entirely. Their psychic abilities allowed them to coordinate across vast distances without relying on conventional communication methods, while their enhanced perception enabled them to detect Necron infiltration attempts and respond to threats that would remain invisible to less gifted races. The conflict itself pushed the Aeldari to develop their abilities further, as the demands of warfare against an implacable enemy forced rapid adaptation and evolution. They learned to weave psychic energy into protective barriers that could deflect even the most sophisticated Necron weaponry, while simultaneously developing offensive techniques that could disrupt the quantum matrices that held Necron warriors together. Their natural affinity for the warp allowed them to strike at targets across multiple dimensions, attacking not only the physical forms of their enemies, but also the underlying structures that sustained Necron consciousness. As the war in heaven progressed, the Aeldari began to demonstrate remarkable resilience and adaptability. While other created races fell to Necron advances or succumbed to the corrupting influence of warp exposure, the Aeldari maintained their cohesion and effectiveness as a fighting force. Their psychic abilities provided them with early warning systems that allowed them to avoid the worst of the Necron's strategic deployments, while their enhanced intellect enabled them to develop counter-strategies for previously unknown Necron technologies. The Old One's gradual withdrawal from direct involvement in the war placed increasing responsibility upon the Aeldari's shoulders. As their creators focused on other projects or retreated to hidden strongholds, the Aeldari found themselves operating with greater independence than ever before. This transition from guided development to autonomous operation marked a crucial phase in their evolution, as they began to develop their own interpretations of the technologies and techniques that the Old Ones had taught them. The disappearance of the Old Ones, whether through death, transcendence, or retreat to dimensions beyond the material universe, left the Aeldari as inheritors of a vast technological and psychic legacy. The knowledge they had gained during their service in the war in heaven formed the foundation for their subsequent rise to galactic prominence, though the full implications of this inheritance would not become apparent until long after the conflict's end. The Necrons' entry into the Great Sleep provided the Aeldari with an opportunity to emerge from the shadow of their creators and establish themselves as an independent galactic power. With their primary enemies dormant and the Old Ones gone, the surviving Aeldari found themselves in possession of advanced technologies and psychic abilities that far exceeded those of any other active species. The galaxy lay before them, scarred by the war in heaven, but rich with possibilities for those bold enough to seize them. The development of Aeldari technology proceeded along lines that reflected their unique nature as psychically gifted beings. Unlike species that relied primarily on mechanical or chemical processes, the Aeldari integrated psychic manipulation into every aspect of their technological advancement. Their understanding of the relationship between consciousness and matter, gained through their Old One heritage and refined through generations of practical application, enabled them to develop technologies that seemed almost magical to less sophisticated observers. Wraithbone construction represented perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Aeldari technological development. This remarkable material, grown rather than manufactured through traditional industrial processes, responded to psychic direction with an organic fluidity that conventional materials could never match. The Aeldari learned to sing Wraithbone into existence, their psychic energies guiding the material's formation according to precise mental templates that could incorporate both functional and aesthetic considerations simultaneously. The creation of Wraithbone required not only psychic ability, but also a deep understanding of the material's fundamental properties. Aeldari craftsmen spent decades learning to perceive the subtle harmonics that governed Wraithbone's behavior, developing the ability to sense the material's potential configurations before beginning the shaping process. The most skilled artisans could grow Wraithbone structures of incredible complexity, creating forms that incorporated multiple functions within seamless, organic designs that appeared to flow like frozen music. Psychic amplification devices emerged as another crucial area of Aeldari technological development. Building upon the Old One's teachings about the relationship between consciousness and warp energy, Aeldari scientists created instruments that could focus and enhance psychic abilities far beyond their natural limits. These devices ranged from personal items like spirit stones, which could store and channel psychic energy, to massive installations capable of projecting psychic effects across entire star systems. The development of these amplification technologies required careful study of the warp's behavior and the ways in which conscious thought could influence immaterial energies. Aeldari researchers mapped the complex interactions between different types of psychic emanation, identifying resonance patterns that could be exploited to create stable amplification effects. Their work in this area laid the groundwork for many of their most impressive achievements, from the creation of artificial worlds to the manipulation of space-time itself. Early webway manipulation represented perhaps the most ambitious aspect of Aeldari technological inheritance from the Old Ones. The webway, that vast network of tunnels and passages that existed between the material universe and the warp, had been one of the Old Ones' greatest achievements. The Aeldari's gradual mastery of webway travel and construction marked their transition from a created race to true inheritors of their maker's legacy. The principles underlying webway construction challenged even the Aeldari's advanced understanding of psychic manipulation and dimensional engineering. The creation of stable passages through the boundary between reality and the warp required precise control over forces that could easily destroy entire worlds if mishandled. Aeldari engineers spent millennia developing the techniques necessary to safely excavate new webway tunnels and maintain existing passages, learning through trial and error how to balance the competing forces that threatened to collapse their constructions. The webway's expansion under Aeldari guidance transformed their civilization's entire strategic outlook. No longer bound by the limitations of conventional space travel, they could establish colonies and outposts across the galaxy without regard for the vast distances that separated star systems. The webway became the circulatory system of their growing empire, carrying not only travelers and goods, but also information and cultural influences that helped maintain unity across their far-flung domains. Mastery of webway technology also provided the Aeldari with significant military advantages. Their ability to move forces rapidly across galactic distances allowed them to respond to threats with unprecedented speed, while their control over webway access points gave them the power to isolate enemy territories or concentrate overwhelming force at crucial strategic locations. The webway became both highway and fortress, enabling the Aeldari to project power across the galaxy while maintaining secure lines of communication and retreat. The integration of these various technological achievements created a civilization unlike any that had existed before or would exist afterward. The Aeldari combined the Old One's scientific legacy with their own innovations to create a society that operated according to principles that transcended the crude mechanical paradigms that would dominate later galactic civilizations. Their technology was alive in ways that purely mechanical devices could never be, responding to thought and emotion with an awareness that blurred the boundaries between tool and consciousness. The technological foundations established during the War in Heaven provided the Aeldari with the tools necessary to reshape the galaxy according to their vision. Over the course of millions of years, following the Necrons' retreat into dormancy, the Aeldari transformed from survivors of an ancient conflict into the architects of the most extensive civilization the galaxy had ever witnessed. Their expansion proceeded not through the crude conquest that would characterize later galactic empires, but through a methodical process of colonization and development that leveraged their superior technology and psychic abilities to establish dominance across countless star systems. The scale of Aeldari expansion defied comprehension by the standards of later civilizations. Where human empires would struggle to maintain control over thousands of worlds, the Aeldari established meaningful presence across millions of planets, each one developed according to carefully planned specifications that reflected both practical necessity and aesthetic preference. Their approach to colonization differed fundamentally from the resource extraction and territorial control that motivated other species, focusing instead on the creation of harmonious environments where Aeldari civilization could flourish in all its diverse manifestations. The selection of worlds for colonization followed complex criteria that encompassed not only material considerations, but also psychic resonance and dimensional stability. Aeldari surveyors possessed the ability to perceive the subtle warp currents that flowed around planetary bodies, identifying locations where the boundary between material and immaterial reality remained stable enough to support large-scale psychic manipulation. These surveys often required decades of careful observation, as the Aeldari learned to map the complex interactions between planetary magnetic fields, stellar radiation, and warp energy that determined a world's suitability for their purposes. Once suitable worlds were identified, the process of development began with the establishment of webway connections that would link each new colony to the greater network of Aeldari civilization. The construction of webway portals required teams of specialist engineers who possessed both the technical knowledge necessary to manipulate dimensional barriers and the psychic sensitivity needed to perceive the subtle currents that governed webway stability. These engineers worked in carefully coordinated groups, their combined psychic abilities focused through sophisticated amplification devices that allowed them to carve stable passages through the boundary between dimensions. The webway portals themselves represented marvels of Aeldari engineering that combined artistic beauty with functional excellence. Each portal was unique, its design reflecting the aesthetic preferences of its creators, while incorporating the complex geometric patterns necessary to maintain dimensional stability. The portals appeared as graceful archways of living wraithbone, their surfaces flowing with patterns of light that responded to the psychic emanations of those who passed through them. The construction process involved the careful growth of wraithbone structures according to precise mathematical specifications, with each component positioned to channel and focus the energies necessary for interdimensional travel. The expansion of the webway network under Aeldari guidance transformed it from the old one's original construction into something far more extensive and sophisticated. Where the ancient webway had connected major strategic locations across the galaxy, the Aeldari version incorporated countless smaller passages that linked individual worlds, cities, and even specific buildings within their empire. This expansion required innovations in webway construction that pushed the boundaries of dimensional engineering, as the Aeldari learned to create stable passages across increasingly complex routes that navigated around the warp's more dangerous regions. The maintenance of this vast network demanded constant attention from teams of specialist technicians who monitored the dimensional barriers that separated webway passages from the chaotic energies of the warp. These technicians developed sophisticated instruments capable of detecting the subtle changes in dimensional stability that preceded catastrophic breaches, allowing them to perform preventive maintenance before problems could escalate into disasters. The work required not only technical expertise, but also considerable personal courage, as maintenance operations often involved exposure to raw warp energy that could destroy unprotected minds in moments. The webway's expansion enabled the development of Aeldari civilization along lines that would have been impossible for species confined to conventional space travel. Ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations could spread across the empire at speeds that approached instantaneous transmission, creating a level of cultural unity that transcended the vast physical distances separating Aeldari worlds. Artists working on worlds separated by tens of thousands of light years could collaborate on projects in real time, while scientists could share research data and experimental results without the delays that would cripple similar efforts by less advanced civilizations. This unprecedented level of connectivity fostered the development of specialized worlds that focused on particular aspects of Aeldari civilization. Some worlds became centers of artistic creation, their entire populations devoted to the exploration of aesthetic possibilities that pushed the boundaries of sensory experience. Others specialized in scientific research, their facilities designed to support experiments that required precise control over environmental conditions or access to rare materials. Still others served as manufacturing centers, where master craftsmen created the sophisticated devices and artworks that sustained Aeldari civilization's high standard of living. The emergence of Aeldari post-scarcity society represented perhaps their greatest achievement during this period of expansion. The combination of advanced psychic manipulation, sophisticated automation, and abundant resources accessed through the webway network eliminated the material constraints that had limited previous civilizations. Aeldari citizens found themselves free from the basic concerns of survival that dominated the lives of less advanced species, able to pursue personal fulfillment and creative expression without regard for economic necessity. The technological foundations of this post-scarcity society relied heavily on the integration of psychic abilities with automated systems. Aeldari manufacturing devices responded to mental commands with a precision that mechanical controls could never match, while their resource extraction systems could be programmed to operate independently for extended periods without direct supervision. The combination of these capabilities with the webway's logistical advantages created a civilization where material goods could be produced and distributed with minimal human intervention, freeing the Aeldari population to focus on higher pursuits. Medical technology advanced to the point where natural death became largely optional for most Aeldari citizens. Their understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical form, enhanced by their psychic abilities and sophisticated biotechnology, enabled them to repair or replace damaged organs and tissues with remarkable ease. Age-related deterioration could be reversed through carefully applied psychic manipulation, while genetic disorders could be corrected at the cellular level using techniques that bordered on miraculous by the standards of later civilizations. The elimination of disease required a comprehensive understanding of biological systems that encompassed not only physical processes, but also the psychic emanations that influenced cellular behavior. Aeldari medical practitioners learned to perceive the subtle energy patterns that preceded the onset of illness, allowing them to intervene before symptoms manifested in the physical body. Their treatments often involved the direct manipulation of biological systems through focused psychic energy, guided by instruments that could monitor the complex interactions between consciousness and matter at the molecular level. The development of life extension technologies raised profound questions about the nature of existence and identity that the Aeldari explored through both philosophical inquiry and practical experimentation. Some individuals chose to extend their natural lifespans indefinitely, accumulating experiences and knowledge over periods that span millennia. Others preferred to undergo periodic renewal processes that restored their bodies to youthful vigor while preserving their memories and accumulated wisdom. Still others experimented with more radical forms of existence, transferring their consciousness to artificial bodies or exploring the possibilities of purely psychic existence. The abundance created by their post-scarcity society enabled the Aeldari to pursue aesthetic and intellectual achievements that surpassed anything accomplished by previous galactic civilizations. Their artists created works that engaged not only the traditional senses, but also psychic perception, producing experiences that could evoke emotional responses impossible for non-psychic species to comprehend. Their architects designed cities that flowed like living organisms, their structures growing and changing in response to the needs and desires of their inhabitants. The integration of advanced technology with daily life proceeded along lines that reflected the Aeldari's unique psychic abilities and aesthetic sensibilities. Their cities incorporated living systems that responded to the emotional states of their inhabitants, adjusting lighting, temperature, and atmospheric composition to optimize comfort and well-being. Transportation systems relied on psychic navigation that could anticipate travelers' destinations before they were consciously chosen, while communication networks transmitted not only information, but also emotional context and sensory impressions. During this period of unprecedented prosperity and expansion, the Aeldari pantheon began to emerge as a distinct religious and cultural force within their civilization. The gods that would later become central to Aeldari spiritual life manifested initially as personifications of the psychic energies generated by their collective consciousness. The intensity of Aeldari psychic emanations, concentrated across millions of worlds and billions of individuals, created resonance patterns in the warp that gradually coalesced into distinct entities with their own personalities and spheres of influence. The emergence of these divine beings represented a natural evolution of Aeldari psychic development rather than a deliberate act of creation. The collective thoughts and emotions of their civilization, focused through their shared cultural experiences and aesthetic preferences, generated warp entities that embodied the highest aspirations and deepest fears of the Aeldari race. These gods possessed power that derived directly from the psychic energy of their worshippers, creating a symbiotic relationship that strengthened both the divine beings and the civilization that sustained them. Each member of the Aeldari pantheon represented different aspects of their civilization's character and values. Asurion, the Phoenix King, embodied the Aeldari sense of nobility and their role as inheritors of the Old One's legacy. His domain encompassed leadership, justice, and the maintenance of cosmic order, reflecting the Aeldari's position as the galaxy's dominant civilization. Isha, the goddess of life, represented their mastery over biological systems and their ability to nurture and protect living beings. Her influence extended over healing, fertility, and the preservation of natural harmony. Kurnus, the hunter, personified the Aeldari's connection to the natural world and their understanding of the balance between creation and destruction. His domain included not only literal hunting, but also the pursuit of knowledge and the exploration of unknown territories. Val the Smith embodied their technological achievements and their ability to create objects of both practical utility and aesthetic beauty. His forge produced the weapons and tools that sustained Aeldari civilization while serving as a symbol of their creative potential. The integration of these divine beings into Aeldari governance structures occurred gradually, as their civilization developed increasingly sophisticated methods for channeling divine guidance into practical decision-making. The gods' influence manifested through oracles and seers, who possessed the psychic sensitivity necessary to perceive divine communications, while their wisdom was incorporated into legal codes and administrative procedures that reflected divine will. This integration created a form of theocratic democracy where divine guidance was balanced against practical necessity and popular consensus. The construction of temples and shrines dedicated to the Aeldari pantheon became a major focus of their architectural efforts during this period. These structures served not only as places of worship, but also as focal points for the psychic energies that sustain the gods' manifestation in the material realm. The temples incorporated sophisticated psychic amplification systems that could concentrate the prayers and offerings of worshippers into coherent energy patterns, strengthening the connection between the divine and mortal realms. The daily lives of Aeldari citizens became increasingly intertwined with religious observance as their pantheon's influence grew stronger. Morning rituals honored Asurion's guidance for the day ahead, while evening ceremonies thanked Isha for the preservation of life and health. Craftsmen invoked Val's blessing before beginning important projects, while hunters sought Kurnus's favor before embarking on expeditions into unexplored territories. These practices created a rhythm of religious observance that permeated every aspect of Aeldari society. The gods' involvement in governance extended beyond mere spiritual guidance to encompass direct participation in major policy decisions. Divine oracles provided input on questions ranging from colonial expansion to resource allocation, while religious festivals served as forums for public debate about important issues. The integration of religious and secular authority created a system of governance that reflected both practical wisdom and divine inspiration, enabling the Aeldari to maintain unity across their vast empire while adapting to changing circumstances. The webway network that the Aeldari inherited from the Old Ones represented merely the skeletal framework of what would become their civilization's greatest achievement, where their ancient creators had constructed a functional but limited system of interdimensional passages connecting major strategic points across the galaxy. The Aeldari transformed this inheritance into a vast arterial network that would serve as the foundation for their galactic dominance. Their expansion and refinement of the webway system proceeded through millennia of careful engineering, as successive generations of Aeldari architects and dimensional specialists pushed the boundaries of what was possible within the treacherous space between the material universe and the warp. The original webway passages created by the Old Ones had been designed primarily for military purposes during the War in Heaven, focusing on rapid troop movement and secure communication between fortress worlds and staging areas. These ancient tunnels carved stable paths through the boundary layer that separated real space from the warp's chaotic depths, but their construction followed conservative principles that prioritized reliability over capacity or convenience. The passages were narrow, their routes often indirect, and their access points limited to heavily fortified installations that could withstand potential breaches from warp entities seeking entry into the material realm. Aeldari engineers approached the expansion of this network with characteristic ambition and artistic sensibility. They recognized that the webway's true potential lay not merely in military applications, but in its capacity to serve as the circulatory system for an entire galactic civilization. Their modifications began with the widening of existing passages to accommodate larger volumes of traffic, a process that required delicate manipulation of dimensional barriers using techniques that pushed their psychic abilities to their limits. The work demanded teams of specialists who could maintain perfect synchronization while reshaping the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The expansion process involved the careful dissolution of existing dimensional barriers, followed by their reconstruction according to new specifications that incorporated both increased capacity and enhanced stability. Aeldari engineers developed specialized tools that could manipulate the exotic matter that formed webway walls, devices that responded to psychic direction with precision measured in fractions of atomic diameters. The reconstruction work proceeded slowly, with each section requiring months of careful preparation before the actual modification could begin. A single miscalculation could result in catastrophic dimensional collapse that would not only destroy the passage being modified, but potentially create a permanent breach, allowing warp entities direct access to the material universe. The creation of entirely new webway passages represented an even greater challenge than the modification of existing routes. Aeldari dimensional architects learned to perceive the subtle currents that flowed through the boundary layer between dimensions, identifying locations where new tunnels could be excavated without destabilizing the surrounding structure. These surveys required years of careful observation, using instruments that could detect fluctuations in dimensional stability too subtle for even enhanced Aeldari senses to perceive directly. The data collected during these surveys was analyzed using mathematical models that incorporated millions of variables, each one representing a factor that could influence the success or failure of the excavation attempt. The actual construction of new webway passages began with the deployment of specialized boring devices that could carve stable tunnels through the dimensional barrier. These machines incorporated both advanced technology and living components, their operation requiring constant psychic guidance from teams of operators who maintained mental contact with the boring process throughout its duration. The devices moved slowly through the dimensional substrate, their progress measured in meters per day as they carefully excavated material that existed in a state between matter and energy. Behind them, construction teams installed the stabilization systems that would maintain the tunnel's integrity once the boring was complete. The stabilization systems themselves represented marvels of Aeldari engineering that combined wraithbone construction with psychic amplification networks. The tunnel walls were lined with living wraithbone that had been grown according to specifications that incorporated complex geometric patterns designed to channel and focus dimensional energies. These patterns served multiple purposes, simultaneously strengthening the tunnel's structure while creating resonance fields that repelled warp entities attempting to breach the webway's defenses. The installation process required master craftsmen who could sing the Wraithbone into its final configuration while maintaining awareness of the dimensional forces that threatened to tear the tunnel apart. As the webway network expanded under Aeldari guidance, it began to incorporate increasingly sophisticated features that reflected their growing understanding of dimensional engineering principles. Junction nodes were constructed at strategic locations where multiple passages intersected, creating hub points that could accommodate complex routing decisions and serve as distribution centers for traffic flowing between different sectors of the network. These nodes incorporated automated guidance systems that could analyze traffic patterns and adjust routing algorithms to optimize flow efficiency, reducing travel times while minimizing the risk of dimensional instabilities caused by excessive passage usage. The development of these junction nodes required innovations in both psychic technology and dimensional architecture. The nodes needed to maintain stable connections to dozens of different passages while providing sufficient space for the sorting and routing of traffic flowing through them. Aeldari engineers created vast hollow spaces within the dimensional substrate, their walls reinforced with complex networks of Wraithbone supports that distributed structural loads across multiple dimensional layers. The internal architecture of these spaces incorporated flowing organic forms that guided traffic movement while creating environments that satisfied Aeldari aesthetic preferences. The construction of Camorra during this period represented the pinnacle of Aeldari webway engineering and their most ambitious architectural project. Unlike the fortress cities that had characterized their earlier colonial efforts, Camorra was designed from the beginning as a major webway port and hub of Aeldari civilization. The city existed entirely within the webway itself, occupying a vast hollow space that had been excavated from the dimensional substrate using techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in dimensional architecture. The location chosen for Camorra offered several strategic advantages that made it ideal for development as a major webway hub. The dimensional currents in the area remained relatively stable, reducing the risk of catastrophic structural failure while providing access to multiple major webway routes that connected different sectors of the Aeldari Empire. The space itself was naturally occurring, a hollow region within the dimensional substrate that required extensive modification rather than complete excavation. This reduced the construction time significantly while providing a foundation that could support the massive structures that would eventually fill the city. The initial development of Camorra focused on the construction of port facilities that could accommodate the increasing volumes of traffic flowing through the webway network. These facilities incorporated sophisticated docking systems that could handle everything from small personal transports to massive cargo vessels carrying resources between different sectors of the Aeldari Empire. The docking systems used gravitational manipulation technology that could guide incoming vessels to their assigned berths without requiring conventional propulsion systems, reducing the risk of accidents while maximizing the efficiency of port operations. The port facilities themselves were architectural marvels that combined functional excellence with the flowing organic forms that characterized Aeldari design preferences. The docking bays were carved from solid wraithbone that had been grown according to specifications that incorporated both structural requirements and aesthetic considerations. The resulting structures appeared to flow like frozen water, their surfaces decorated with intricate patterns that served both decorative and functional purposes. The patterns incorporated psychic resonance circuits that could monitor the dimensional stability of docked vessels while providing guidance information to their crews. Beyond the port facilities, Camorra's development included the construction of residential districts designed to accommodate the growing population of Aeldari who chose to make the city their permanent home. These districts incorporated the same organic architectural principles that characterized other Aeldari settlements, but their design was adapted to the unique conditions that existed within the webway itself. The buildings were constructed entirely from wraithbone that had been specially treated to provide protection against the dimensional energies that flowed through the webway's structure. The residential architecture of early Camorra reflected the prosperity and optimism that characterized Aeldari civilization during this period. The buildings incorporated spacious living areas designed to accommodate extended families, while their exteriors featured elaborate decorative elements that demonstrated the wealth and status of their inhabitants. Gardens were integrated into the building designs, their plants specially adapted to thrive in the artificial environment that existed within the webway. These gardens served both aesthetic and practical purposes, providing fresh air and food while creating pleasant environments for relaxation and social interaction. The strategic advantages provided by webway mastery transformed every aspect of Aeldari military doctrine and political strategy. Their ability to move forces rapidly across galactic distances without relying on conventional space travel gave them tactical superiority over any potential enemy who lacked similar capabilities. Aeldari military commanders could concentrate overwhelming force at any point within their empire, within hours of receiving intelligence about potential threats, while their control over webway access points allowed them to isolate enemy territories and prevent hostile forces from coordinating their activities across multiple star systems. The webway's military applications extended beyond simple troop movement to encompass sophisticated strategic deception and intelligence-gathering operations. Aeldari forces could appear at locations where their presence was impossible according to conventional understanding of space travel, striking at enemy installations before disappearing back into the webway network. These hit-and-run tactics proved devastatingly effective against enemies who relied on conventional military doctrine, as their defensive preparations were rendered useless by the Aeldari's ability to bypass traditional approaches entirely. The intelligence advantages provided by webway access were equally significant. Aeldari scouts could penetrate deep into enemy territory without using conventional spacecraft that might be detected by sensor networks, while their ability to establish temporary observation posts in locations accessible only through the webway gave them unprecedented surveillance capabilities. Information gathered through these operations could be transmitted back to command centers within hours, enabling Aeldari leaders to make strategic decisions based on current intelligence rather than outdated reports that might be weeks or months old. The webway network also provided crucial protection from the growing warp storms and chaos influences that increasingly affected real space during the later periods of Aeldari dominance. As their civilization's psychic activities intensified and their population grew across millions of worlds, the collective emanations of Aeldari consciousness began to create disturbances in the warp that attracted the attention of malevolent entities dwelling in that realm's depths. The webway's isolation from direct warp contact provided a sanctuary where Aeldari citizens could travel and conduct business without exposure to the corrupting influences that threatened those who ventured into the immaterial realm itself. The protection offered by the webway became increasingly important as Aeldari society evolved toward greater psychic sophistication and emotional intensity. Their post-scarcity civilization had eliminated the material constraints that had previously channeled their energies toward practical pursuits, freeing them to explore increasingly esoteric forms of experience and sensation. These explorations generated psychic emanations that resonated through the warp with growing intensity, creating feedback loops that amplified both their experiences and the disturbances they created in the immaterial realm. The webway's dimensional barriers served as effective shields against most forms of warp intrusion, their exotic matter construction providing protection that conventional materials could never match. The barriers were designed to remain impermeable to psychic influences while allowing the passage of physical matter and controlled energy discharges. This selective permeability enabled Aeldari travelers to use their psychic abilities within webway passages while remaining protected from external warp entities that might attempt to influence or possess them during transit. The maintenance of these protective barriers required constant vigilance from teams of specialists who monitored the webway network for signs of dimensional instability or attempted breaches. These monitoring systems incorporated both technological sensors and psychic detection methods, creating overlapping coverage that could identify threats from multiple different sources. The specialists responsible for webway security developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for reinforcing damaged barriers and detecting subtle signs of warp intrusion before they could develop into serious breaches. The webway's completion as a comprehensive galactic transportation network coincided with the emergence of Aeldari society's most remarkable characteristics. The technological mastery that enabled their control over interdimensional travel was matched by an equally sophisticated approach to social organization that prioritized individual excellence while maintaining collective harmony. Unlike the rigid hierarchical structures that would characterize later galactic civilizations, Aeldari society developed along fluid lines that allowed citizens to pursue their interests and talents without artificial barriers imposed by birth or social status. The fundamental principle underlying Aeldari social organization was the belief that every individual possessed unique potential that could contribute to their civilization's collective achievement. This philosophy emerged naturally from their psychic nature, as Aeldari citizens could perceive the distinctive mental patterns that characterized different forms of talent and ability. Rather than forcing individuals into predetermined roles based on family background or economic necessity, Aeldari society encouraged exploration and experimentation that allowed each person to discover their natural aptitudes and develop them to their fullest extent. The absence of material scarcity eliminated the economic pressures that typically drove social stratification in less advanced civilizations. Aeldari citizens did not compete for limited resources or struggle to meet basic survival needs, freeing them to focus on personal development and creative expression. This liberation from economic constraint created a society where status derived from achievement and artistic merit rather than wealth accumulation or political power. The most respected members of Aeldari society were those who had mastered their chosen disciplines to levels that approached perfection, regardless of whether those disciplines involved warfare, artistry, scientific research, or philosophical inquiry. The pursuit of perfection became the defining characteristic of Aeldari culture during this golden age. Citizens approached their chosen fields of interest with an intensity and dedication that surpassed anything achieved by previous galactic civilizations. This commitment to excellence was not driven by external pressure or competitive necessity, but rather by an internal compulsion to explore the full potential of their enhanced abilities. Aeldari artists spent decades perfecting individual techniques, while warriors devoted centuries to mastering combat forms that incorporated both physical skill and psychic manipulation. The Aeldari concept of perfection encompassed not only technical mastery, but also aesthetic refinement and emotional depth. Their artists created works that engaged multiple levels of perception simultaneously, incorporating visual beauty, psychic resonance, and symbolic meaning into unified expressions that could evoke profound responses in those who experienced them. Their warriors developed fighting styles that transformed combat into a form of deadly dance, where every movement served both tactical purpose and aesthetic expression. Their philosophers explored questions of existence and meaning with a thoroughness that incorporated both logical analysis and intuitive insight. This pursuit of excellence was facilitated by the longevity that Aeldari medical technology provided. Citizens who chose to extend their natural lifespans could dedicate centuries or even millennia to the development of their chosen skills, achieving levels of mastery that would be impossible for shorter-lived species. The accumulation of experience over such extended periods enabled Aeldari masters to develop techniques and insights that built upon generations of previous achievement, creating a continuous process of refinement and innovation that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in any given field. The social recognition accorded to masters of various disciplines created informal networks of excellence that transcended traditional organizational boundaries. Master craftsmen from different worlds collaborated on projects that combined their specialized knowledge, while warrior philosophers developed new combat techniques that incorporated insights from multiple martial traditions. These collaborations were facilitated by the Webway network, which allowed masters to travel instantly between different centers of learning and share their knowledge with colleagues across the galaxy. The development of these informal networks of excellence gradually evolved into more structured forms of organization that would eventually become the foundation for the path system that would characterize later Aeldari society. During their golden age, these structures remained flexible and voluntary, allowing individuals to move freely between different areas of study and practice. Citizens might spend decades mastering the intricacies of wraithbone sculpture before transitioning to the study of dimensional engineering, then later pursue excellence in combat techniques or psychic development. The early forms of disciplined pursuit that emerged during this period reflected the Aeldari understanding that true mastery required not only natural talent, but also systematic training and mental discipline. Citizens who chose to pursue excellence in any particular field were expected to commit themselves fully to that pursuit, dedicating their time and energy to the development of the skills and knowledge necessary for true mastery. This commitment involved not only the acquisition of technical abilities, but also the cultivation of the mental states and emotional control that enabled peak performance. The training methods developed by Aeldari masters incorporated both physical practice and psychic discipline. Students learned to focus their minds with laser-like intensity while maintaining awareness of the subtle energies that flowed through all living beings. This dual focus enabled them to achieve levels of performance that transcended what was possible through purely physical training, as their psychic abilities enhanced their natural capabilities while providing access to information and insights that existed beyond the range of conventional perception. The integration of psychic abilities into training regimens created distinctive pedagogical approaches that were uniquely suited to Aeldari physiology and psychology. Masters taught their students to perceive the energy patterns that accompanied different emotional and mental states, enabling them to recognize and control the internal conditions that supported optimal performance. Students learned to modulate their psychic emanations to achieve specific effects, whether those involved enhancing their physical capabilities, improving their artistic sensitivity, or deepening their philosophical understanding. The psychic integration that characterized Aeldari training methods extended beyond individual development to encompass group activities and collaborative endeavors. Teams of students working together could synchronize their psychic emanations to achieve collective effects that surpassed what any individual could accomplish alone. These collaborative techniques were particularly important in disciplines that required large-scale coordination, such as the construction of major architectural projects or the performance of complex artistic works that involved multiple participants. The role of psychic abilities in daily Aeldari life extended far beyond their application in specialized training or professional activities. Citizens used their psychic capabilities for routine communication, transmitting not only verbal information, but also emotional context and sensory impressions that enriched the meaning of their interactions. These psychic communications created a level of intimacy and understanding between individuals that was impossible for non-psychic species to achieve, fostering social bonds that transcended the limitations of conventional language. Transportation within Aeldari cities relied heavily on psychic navigation systems that could anticipate travelers' destinations and adjust routing accordingly. Citizens approaching public transit systems found that vehicles were already positioned to take them where they needed to go, while pedestrian walkways adjusted their configuration to optimize traffic flow based on the collective intentions of those using them. These systems created an environment where movement through urban spaces felt natural and effortless, as the city itself seemed to respond to the needs and desires of its inhabitants. The integration of psychic abilities into domestic life transformed the basic activities of daily existence into opportunities for artistic expression and personal development. Aeldari homes incorporated responsive environments that adjusted lighting, temperature, and atmospheric composition based on the emotional states and preferences of their occupants. Cooking became a form of psychic artistry, where chefs could enhance the flavor and nutritional value of food through focused mental manipulation, while gardening involved direct communication with plants that enabled unprecedented levels of horticultural achievement. The artistic applications of psychic abilities reached levels of sophistication that defied description in conventional terms. Aeldari musicians created compositions that incorporated psychic harmonies alongside traditional musical elements, producing works that could evoke specific emotional responses while simultaneously conveying complex philosophical concepts. Their visual artists developed techniques that allowed them to paint with light itself, creating displays that existed partially in the material realm and partially in psychic space. Sculptors learned to shape matter at the molecular level through concentrated will, producing works that incorporated moving elements and responsive surfaces. The scientific applications of psychic abilities enabled Aeldari researchers to explore phenomena that remained beyond the reach of purely technological investigation. Their ability to perceive dimensional currents allowed them to map the complex interactions between real space and the warp with unprecedented accuracy, while their capacity for direct mental manipulation of matter enabled experiments that would have been impossible using conventional laboratory techniques. Research teams could share sensory impressions and analytical insights directly, creating collaborative investigations that leveraged the combined psychic abilities of multiple specialists. Philosophical inquiry among the Aeldari incorporated psychic exploration of consciousness and reality that transcended the limitations of purely intellectual analysis. Philosophers could experience alternative states of awareness that provided direct insight into the nature of existence, while their enhanced perception allowed them to detect subtle patterns and connections that remained invisible to conventional observation. These investigations produced philosophical systems that integrated empirical observation with mystical experience, creating comprehensive worldviews that addressed both practical and transcendent concerns. The governance structures that emerged during this golden age reflected the Aeldari commitment to excellence and individual achievement while maintaining collective harmony. Leadership positions were typically filled by individuals who had demonstrated mastery in relevant fields, whether those involved military command, artistic creation, scientific research, or philosophical wisdom. The selection of leaders relied heavily on psychic assessment of candidates' capabilities and character, as Aeldari citizens could perceive the mental patterns that indicated true competence and integrity. The decision-making processes used by Aeldari governing bodies incorporated both rational analysis and psychic insight, creating deliberative procedures that could access information and perspectives unavailable to purely logical approaches. Council meetings involved not only verbal debate, but also the sharing of psychic impressions and intuitive insights that enriched the discussion and revealed aspects of complex issues that might otherwise remain hidden. These enhanced deliberative processes enabled Aeldari leaders to make decisions that reflected both practical wisdom and deeper understanding of the forces that shaped their civilization's development. The judicial systems that maintained order within Aeldari society relied on psychic investigation techniques that could determine truth with remarkable accuracy. Judges possessed the ability to perceive the mental states and emotional patterns of those who appeared before them, enabling them to distinguish between honest testimony and deliberate deception. This psychic insight was balanced by careful attention to evidence and logical analysis, creating judicial procedures that combine the advantages of enhanced perception with rigorous adherence to established principles of justice. The educational systems that prepared young Aeldari for adult participation in their sophisticated society incorporated psychic development alongside traditional academic subjects. Students learned to control and focus their psychic abilities while acquiring the knowledge and skills necessary for meaningful contribution to their civilization's ongoing development. The curriculum emphasized both individual excellence and collaborative achievement, preparing students to pursue personal mastery while maintaining their connections to the broader community that sustained Aeldari culture. The sophisticated educational systems and pursuit of excellence that had defined Aeldari civilization for millennia began to show signs of fundamental transformation as their society entered its final golden age. The very success of their post-scarcity civilization, combined with their extended lifespans and mastery over material constraints, created conditions that would gradually undermine the disciplined pursuits that had previously channeled their energies toward constructive ends. The absence of external challenges or internal pressures that might have maintained their focus on achievement and refinement left successive generations of Aeldari citizens increasingly free to explore the full range of experiences that their enhanced physiology and psychic abilities made possible. The initial stages of this transformation manifested as a subtle shift in priorities rather than an obvious abandonment of traditional values. Aeldari citizens who had achieved mastery in their chosen disciplines began to seek new forms of stimulation and challenge, having exhausted the conventional boundaries of their fields of expertise. Artists who had perfected traditional techniques began experimenting with increasingly esoteric forms of expression that pushed beyond established aesthetic boundaries. Warriors who had mastered every conventional combat form started developing new approaches that incorporated elements of risk and unpredictability that had been absent from their carefully structured training regimens. The pursuit of novel experiences gained momentum as it became clear that their civilization's technological capabilities could support virtually any form of exploration or experimentation that citizens might desire. The Webway network provided access to countless worlds where different environments and conditions could be established for specific purposes, while their advanced biotechnology enabled the modification of sensory organs and neural pathways to enhance the perception of previously undetectable stimuli. Citizens began to view their own bodies and minds as instruments that could be refined and modified to access ever more sophisticated forms of experience. The modification of sensory capabilities became a widespread practice among Aeldari seeking to expand their perceptual range beyond natural limitations. Biotechnicians developed techniques for enhancing visual acuity to perceive electromagnetic spectra that had previously been invisible, while auditory modifications enabled the detection of sound frequencies that existed beyond the normal range of Aeldari hearing. Tactile enhancements increased sensitivity to temperature, pressure, and texture variations, creating opportunities for experiences that incorporated subtle sensory distinctions that unmodified individuals could not appreciate. These sensory modifications were often combined with neural alterations that enhanced the brain's capacity to process and integrate complex sensory information. Citizens who underwent these procedures could experience synesthesia effects, where different sensory inputs created cross-modal perceptions, such as seeing sounds or hearing colors. The resulting experiences possessed an intensity and complexity that far exceeded anything possible through natural sensory mechanisms, creating a new category of aesthetic appreciation that became increasingly popular among those seeking novel forms of stimulation. The enhancement of pain perception represented a particularly significant development in this progression towards sensory extremes. Initially, these modifications were pursued by individuals interested in exploring the philosophical and psychological aspects of suffering as a component of complete experience. They argued that a truly comprehensive understanding of existence required direct knowledge of all possible sensations, including those that conventional wisdom sought to avoid or minimize. The enhanced perception of pain that these modifications provided enabled experiences of extraordinary intensity that seemed to offer insights into fundamental aspects of consciousness and reality. The practitioners of enhanced pain perception developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies designed to explore the full range of sensations that their modified nervous systems could provide. These events incorporated carefully controlled infliction of various forms of physical discomfort, ranging from subtle pressure applications to more dramatic procedures that would have been unbearable for unmodified individuals. The participants reported that these experiences produced altered states of consciousness that provided access to forms of awareness and understanding that could not be achieved through conventional means. The philosophical justifications for these practices drew upon ancient Aeldari concepts of balance and completeness that emphasized the importance of experiencing all aspects of existence, rather than limiting oneself to conventionally pleasant sensations. Proponents argued that their enhanced pain perception enabled them to achieve a form of enlightenment that transcended the artificial distinctions between pleasure and suffering that constrained less adventurous individuals. They claimed that the intensity of their experiences provided direct access to fundamental truths about the nature of consciousness and reality that could not be discovered through intellectual analysis alone. The gradual expansion of these experimental practices coincided with the emergence of organized groups dedicated to the systematic exploration of extreme sensations and experiences. These early pleasure cults began as informal gatherings of like-minded individuals who shared interests in pushing beyond conventional boundaries of experience and sensation. The participants were typically accomplished citizens who had achieved mastery in traditional fields, but found themselves seeking new forms of challenge and stimulation that could match the intensity of their previous achievements. The organizational structure of these early cults reflected their origins among the educated and accomplished members of Aeldari society. Leadership positions were typically held by individuals who possessed both extensive knowledge of the theoretical principles underlying their practices and practical experience in the application of enhancement technologies. These leaders served as guides and instructors for newer members, sharing techniques and insights that had been developed through years of systematic experimentation with various forms of sensory modification and experience enhancement. The recruitment practices employed by these cults focused on individuals who had demonstrated exceptional achievement in conventional fields, but showed signs of dissatisfaction with the limitations imposed by traditional approaches to excellence. The cult leaders possessed sufficient psychic sensitivity to identify potential recruits who exhibited the mental patterns associated with readiness for more extreme forms of experience. These recruitment efforts were conducted discreetly, as the cults recognized that their practices might be viewed with suspicion by more conservative members of Aeldari society. The initiation procedures developed by the pleasure cults incorporated both physical modifications and psychological preparation designed to enable new members to participate safely in increasingly intense experiences. Initiates underwent gradual sensory enhancement that allowed their nervous systems to adapt to higher levels of stimulation without suffering permanent damage. The psychological preparation involved training in mental techniques that enabled conscious control over pain responses and emotional reactions, allowing participants to maintain awareness and analytical capability even during extremely intense experiences. The facilities constructed for cult activities represented significant investments in specialized architecture and biotechnology designed to support the safe exploration of extreme sensations. These installations incorporated advanced medical monitoring systems that could track participants' physiological responses in real time, enabling immediate intervention if dangerous conditions developed. The architectural design of these facilities reflected Aeldari aesthetic preferences while incorporating functional elements necessary for their specialized purposes, creating environments that were simultaneously beautiful and conducive to intense experiential exploration. The development of increasingly sophisticated torture devices and enhancement technologies became a major focus of cult activities as members sought to push beyond the limitations of conventional approaches to sensation and experience. These devices incorporated advanced materials and psychic amplification systems that could produce precisely controlled forms of stimulation tailored to individual preferences and tolerances. The design and construction of these instruments became a specialized field that attracted some of the most talented technicians and artists in Aeldari society. The psychic amplification systems integrated into these devices enabled experiences that transcended purely physical sensation to encompass direct manipulation of consciousness and awareness. Participants could experience altered states of perception, where the boundaries between self and environment became blurred, creating opportunities for forms of awareness that seemed to provide access to fundamental aspects of reality. These psychic enhancement effects became increasingly important as cult members developed tolerances for purely physical forms of stimulation and required more sophisticated approaches to achieve desired levels of intensity. The gladiatorial arenas that began appearing in various Aeldari cities represented the public manifestation of the violence and extremism that had previously been confined to private cult activities. These facilities were initially presented as venues for artistic expression that incorporated elements of combat and physical challenge, appealing to citizens who sought more dynamic forms of entertainment than conventional artistic performances could provide. The early gladiatorial events featured skilled warriors demonstrating combat techniques in controlled environments where the risk of serious injury remained minimal. The evolution of these gladiatorial presentations toward genuine violence occurred gradually as audiences developed tolerances for staged combat and began demanding more authentic experiences. The warriors participating in these events were initially volunteers who viewed the arena as an opportunity to demonstrate their skills and achieve recognition for their martial abilities. The combat rules were modified over time to allow increasingly realistic engagements, with safety restrictions gradually removed as participants and audiences alike sought more intense and authentic experiences. The weapons and equipment used in gladiatorial combat incorporated advanced Aeldari technology that enabled spectacular displays of skill and violence, while maintaining the aesthetic refinement that characterized their civilization's approach to all forms of expression. The gladiators wore armor that provided protection against conventional weapons, while allowing sufficient vulnerability to create genuine risk and excitement. Their weapons were crafted to produce visually impressive effects while delivering precise and controlled damage that could disable opponents without necessarily causing immediate death. The architecture of the gladiatorial arenas reflected the same attention to aesthetic excellence that characterized other Aeldari constructions, but incorporated functional elements designed to enhance the spectacle of combat. The seating arrangements provided optimal viewing angles while incorporating psychic amplification systems that allowed spectators to share in the emotional intensity experienced by the combatants. The arena floors were constructed from materials that could be easily cleaned and reconfigured between events, enabling rapid transitions between different types of combat scenarios. The popularity of gladiatorial entertainment spread rapidly throughout Aeldari civilization as the webway network enabled easy distribution of recordings and live transmissions of particularly spectacular events. Citizens on distant worlds could experience arena combat with the same immediacy and intensity as those physically present, creating a shared cultural phenomenon that transcended geographical boundaries. The most successful gladiators achieved celebrity status that rivaled the recognition previously reserved for masters of traditional disciplines. The murder cults that emerged from the intersection of pleasure-seeking and gladiatorial violence represented the most extreme manifestation of Aeldari society's descent into moral decay. These organizations combined the systematic exploration of extreme sensations practiced by the pleasure cults with the public spectacle and genuine violence of the gladiatorial arenas. The murder cults attracted individuals who had exhausted the possibilities offered by conventional pleasure-seeking and required the ultimate intensity that could only be achieved through the deliberate taking of life. The rituals developed by murder cults incorporated elaborate ceremonies that transformed killing into a form of artistic expression and spiritual practice. Participants believed that the moment of death represented the ultimate experience that could be shared between individuals, with the killer gaining access to the victim's final thoughts and emotions through psychic connection. These beliefs provided philosophical justification for practices that involved the systematic torture and murder of victims selected according to criteria that emphasized their capacity to provide intense experiences for cult members. The recruitment practices employed by murder cults focused on individuals who had already participated in pleasure cult activities, but found themselves seeking even more extreme forms of stimulation. The psychological profiles of murder cult recruits typically showed patterns of escalating sensation-seeking behavior combined with diminished empathy for the suffering of others. The cult leaders possessed sufficient psychic ability to identify individuals whose mental patterns indicated readiness for participation in lethal activities. The influence of these various cult movements on Aeldari politics began to manifest as their membership expanded to include individuals who held positions of authority within governmental and administrative structures. Politicians who had joined pleasure cults found their decision-making processes influenced by the philosophical frameworks and value systems promoted by these organizations. The emphasis on individual experience and sensation-seeking that characterized cult ideology began to compete with traditional Aeldari values that emphasized collective responsibility and long-term planning. The corruption of governmental institutions proceeded gradually as cult members achieved positions of influence within various administrative agencies and policy-making bodies. These individuals used their authority to redirect resources toward projects that supported cult activities, while reducing oversight and regulation that might have limited their expansion. The modification of legal codes to accommodate increasingly extreme forms of behavior reflected the growing political influence of cult ideology within Aeldari governmental structures. The economic impact of cult activities became increasingly significant as substantial resources were diverted from traditional productive activities toward the construction and maintenance of facilities dedicated to extreme experimentation and entertainment. The most elaborate torture palaces and gladiatorial complexes required enormous investments in specialized technology and architectural construction that provided little benefit to Aeldari society beyond the satisfaction of cult members' desires for increasingly intense experiences. The psychic emanations generated by the Aeldari's increasingly extreme pursuits began to manifest effects within the warp that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of their actions. The immaterial realm, that chaotic dimension where thought and emotion took on substance and form, responded to the collective psychic output of billions of Aeldari minds with a sensitivity that reflected the species' inherent connection to that otherworldly space. Each act of excess, every moment of intensified sensation, and all expressions of extreme emotion created ripples within the warp's turbulent currents that gradually began to coalesce into patterns of increasing complexity and coherence. The initial stages of this coalescence occurred over millennia as the scattered psychic impressions left by individual acts of depravity began to resonate with similar emanations from across the galaxy. The warp's malleable nature enabled these disparate psychic fragments to attract and merge with one another, forming larger concentrations of emotional energy that possessed rudimentary consciousness. These early manifestations lacked the coherent identity and focused purpose that would characterize their eventual evolution, existing instead as chaotic amalgamations of sensation and desire that drifted through the immaterial realm without clear direction or intent. The process of psychic coalescence accelerated as Aeldari society's descent into excess deepened and spread throughout their civilization. The webway network that had once served as their greatest achievement now facilitated the rapid transmission of corrupt practices and philosophies across their empire. Citizens who might have remained isolated from the most extreme manifestations of pleasure-seeking found themselves exposed to ideas and techniques that pushed them towards similar pursuits. The cultural transmission of these practices created feedback loops that amplified the psychic disturbances emanating from Aeldari worlds. The pleasure cult's systematic exploration of enhanced sensation created particularly intense psychic emanations that possessed distinctive characteristics within the warp. Unlike the diffuse emotional energy generated by conventional experiences, the focused intensity achieved through sensory modification and extreme stimulation produced psychic impressions that maintained their coherence over extended periods. These concentrated emanations served as nucleation points around which other psychic fragments could aggregate, accelerating the formation of larger and more stable warp entities. The murder cult's activities generated psychic emanations of exceptional potency that reflected the ultimate nature of the experiences they pursued. The moment of death, particularly when accompanied by extreme physical and emotional trauma, created psychic shockwaves that resonated through the warp with tremendous force. The deliberate infliction of suffering and the systematic exploration of pain and terror produced emanations that possessed a distinctive signature within the immaterial realm, one that attracted similar energies and facilitated their aggregation into increasingly powerful concentrations. The gradual emergence of a coherent consciousness within these aggregated psychic emanations marked a crucial transition in the development of what would eventually become known as Slaanesh. The entity that began to take shape within the warp possessed characteristics that directly reflected the nature of the Aeldari activities that had given it birth. It embodied the pursuit of sensation and experience pushed to absolute extremes, the transformation of pleasure into obsession, and the corruption of aesthetic refinement into decadent excess. This emerging consciousness fed upon the psychic emanations generated by Aeldari depravity, while simultaneously influencing the thoughts and desires of those whose activities sustained its growth. The feeding relationship that developed between the nascent chaos entity and Aeldari society created a self-reinforcing cycle that accelerated both the corruption of Aeldari civilization and the strengthening of the warp presence that would become Slaanesh. As the entity grew in power and coherence, its influence began to manifest in subtle ways that encouraged even greater extremes of behavior among the Aeldari. Citizens who had previously maintained some degree of restraint found themselves compelled to explore increasingly dangerous and destructive forms of experience, driven by impulses that seemed to originate from within their own consciousness, but actually reflected the growing influence of the chaos entity that fed upon their actions. The psychic amplification systems that the Aeldari had integrated into their technology and architecture inadvertently served to strengthen this malevolent influence. Devices designed to enhance legitimate psychic abilities also amplified the subtle emanations through which the growing chaos entity could affect Aeldari minds. The Wraithbone constructions that formed the basis of their cities and installations possessed inherent psychic conductivity that enabled the transmission of corrupting influences across vast distances. The very infrastructure of Aeldari civilization became a conduit for the spread of the entity's malign influence. The temporal aspects of this corruption process reflected the complex relationship between linear time in the material universe and the non-linear nature of warp existence. The chaos entity that was forming within the immaterial realm existed partially outside conventional temporal constraints, enabling it to influence events across different periods simultaneously. Actions taken by Aeldari in their civilizations past could strengthen the entity's influence on their descendants, while future acts of depravity could retroactively enhance its power to corrupt earlier generations. This temporal feedback created a web of causality that made the corruption process increasingly difficult to interrupt or reverse. The dreams and visions experienced by psychically sensitive Aeldari began to reflect the growing presence of the nascent chaos entity as its influence strengthened. Citizens reported increasingly vivid and disturbing dreams that featured scenarios of extreme pleasure and pain, often involving the dreamer as both participant and observer in acts of spectacular depravity. These dreams possessed a hyperreal quality that made them more memorable and emotionally impactful than normal dream experiences, creating lasting impressions that influenced the dreamer's waking thoughts and desires. The content of these corrupted dreams often included detailed instructions for the construction of devices, and the performance of rituals that would enhance the dreamer's capacity for extreme experience. Citizens who followed these dream-inspired instructions found that the resulting activities produced sensations of unprecedented intensity, reinforcing their belief in the validity of the visions, while strengthening their psychological dependence on increasingly extreme forms of stimulation. The knowledge transmitted through these dreams often exceeded the recipient's conscious understanding of the relevant technologies and techniques, suggesting an external source of information that operated through psychic channels. The artistic expressions created by Aeldari during this period began to incorporate themes and imagery that reflected the growing influence of the nascent chaos entity. Sculptors found themselves compelled to create works that depicted scenes of exquisite torture and transcendent suffering, while painters produced canvases that seemed to writhe with barely contained energy and emotion. Musicians composed pieces that incorporated discordant harmonies and psychic resonances that could induce altered states of consciousness in their audiences, often leading to spontaneous outbreaks of violent or sexually extreme behavior during performances. The architectural projects undertaken during this period reflected similar influences, as Aeldari builders constructed increasingly elaborate facilities dedicated to the pursuit of extreme experiences. These buildings incorporated design elements that seemed to encourage particular forms of behavior among their occupants, with flowing corridors that guided movement toward chambers equipped for increasingly intense forms of sensation and experience. The wraithbone used in these constructions was often grown according to patterns that incorporated psychic resonance circuits designed to amplify and focus the emotional emanations generated by the activities conducted within. The gladiatorial arenas constructed during this period became focal points for particularly intense psychic emanations, as the violence they hosted grew increasingly elaborate and extreme. The architecture of these facilities was modified to channel and concentrate the psychic energy generated by both participants and spectators, creating environments where the boundary between material and immaterial reality became increasingly thin. Spectators reported experiencing direct psychic connection with the combatants, feeling their pain and terror as if it were their own, while simultaneously experiencing intense pleasure from the vicarious participation in violence. The weapons and torture devices created by Aeldari craftsmen during this period incorporated increasingly sophisticated psychic amplification systems that enhanced both the physical and emotional impact of their use. These instruments were designed not merely to inflict pain, but to create specific patterns of suffering that would generate optimal psychic emanations for feeding the growing chaos entity. The most elaborate devices incorporated living components that could respond to the victim's mental state, adjusting their operation to maintain precise levels of agony and terror that maximized the psychic energy produced. The scientific research conducted by Aeldari during this period increasingly focused on the systematic study of pain, pleasure, and the relationship between physical sensation and psychic emanation. Research teams developed precise methodologies for measuring and categorizing different types of suffering, creating taxonomies of torment that enabled the optimization of torture techniques for maximum psychic impact. These studies were often presented as legitimate scientific inquiry into the nature of consciousness and sensation, providing intellectual justification for activities that served primarily to feed the growing chaos entity. The medical technologies developed during this period reflected similar corruption, as Aeldari biotechnicians created increasingly sophisticated methods for sustaining victims through extended periods of torture and extreme experience. Life support systems were designed to maintain consciousness and sensitivity even under conditions that would normally result in death or unconsciousness, enabling the prolonged extraction of psychic energy from suffering subjects. Regeneration techniques allowed for the repeated infliction of damage and healing, creating cycles of destruction and renewal that could be sustained indefinitely. The expansion of these corrupt practices throughout Aeldari space was facilitated by the webway network that enabled rapid travel and communication between different worlds and installations. Techniques and technologies developed in one location could be transmitted across the galaxy within days, allowing for the rapid standardization and refinement of methods for generating intense psychic emanations. The most successful practitioners achieved celebrity status that rivaled traditional masters of conventional disciplines, their innovations spreading throughout Aeldari civilization with unprecedented speed. The final millennia before the fall witnessed an exponential acceleration in both the intensity of Aeldari depravity and the corresponding growth of the chaos entity that fed upon their activities. The practices that had once been confined to secretive cults became mainstream cultural phenomena as the entity's influence overwhelmed the psychological defenses that had previously maintained some degree of restraint among the Aeldari population. Entire worlds became dedicated to the pursuit of increasingly extreme forms of experience, their populations abandoning all pretense of productive activity in favor of total immersion in sensation-seeking and violence. The psychic storms that began manifesting in real space around Aeldari worlds reflected the growing instability created by their activities within the warp. These disturbances initially appeared as localized anomalies that affected only the immediate vicinity of the most corrupt installations, but gradually expanded to encompass entire star systems as the intensity of psychic emanations increased. Navigation through these affected regions became increasingly dangerous as the boundary between material and immaterial reality grew thin, allowing warp entities to manifest directly in real space. The prophetic warnings delivered by some Aeldari seers during this period provided clear evidence of the catastrophic consequences that would result from their civilization's continued descent into depravity. These prescient individuals possessed sufficient psychic sensitivity to perceive the growing chaos entity within the warp and understand the implications of its continued strengthening. Their visions revealed the ultimate fate that awaited their species if the current trajectory continued, showing images of worlds consumed by psychic fire and populations devoured by the very entity they were unknowingly feeding through their actions. The specific details provided by these prophetic visions included precise descriptions of the cataclysmic event that would mark the birth of the new Chaos God. The seers described a moment when the accumulated psychic energy generated by millennia of Aeldari excess would reach critical mass, causing the nascent entity to achieve full consciousness and power within the warp. This birth would create a psychic shockwave that would tear through real space, destroying the Aeldari Empire and consuming the souls of billions of individuals whose psychic emanations had contributed to the entity's creation. The warnings delivered by these seers also included detailed instructions for avoiding the coming catastrophe through the abandonment of the corrupt practices that were feeding the growing chaos entity. They advocated for the immediate cessation of all pleasure cult activities, the destruction of the torture devices and gladiatorial arenas that had become focal points for psychic emanation, and the implementation of strict psychological discipline that would prevent further corruption of Aeldari consciousness. Some seers went further, recommending the complete abandonment of their advanced civilization in favor of a return to simpler forms of existence that would not generate the intense psychic emanations that sustained the chaos entity. The Exodite movement that emerged in response to these warnings represented the most significant organized attempt to escape the coming catastrophe through voluntary exile from mainstream Aeldari civilization. The leaders of this movement recognized that the corruption had become too deeply embedded within their society's institutions and technologies to be eliminated through reform or restraint. They advocated for the complete abandonment of the webway network, the advanced technologies, and the urban centers that had become focal points for the spreading corruption. The Exodites' preparation for their exodus involved the identification and colonization of worlds that possessed the characteristics necessary to support sustainable populations without reliance on the advanced technologies that had become corrupted by chaos influence. These worlds were typically less developed planets with stable ecosystems that could support agriculture and simple manufacturing without requiring the sophisticated psychic amplification systems that had become integral to mainstream Aeldari civilization. The selection process required careful evaluation of each world's psychic resonance characteristics to ensure that they would not amplify the corrupting influences that the Exodites sought to escape. The rejection of these warnings by the majority of Aeldari society reflected the depth of corruption that had already taken hold within their civilization. Citizens who had become dependent on increasingly extreme forms of experience found themselves unable to contemplate the abandonment of the practices that had become central to their existence. The psychological addiction to intense sensation and the influence of the growing chaos entity combined to create powerful resistance to any suggestion that their current lifestyle might be dangerous or unsustainable. The political and social institutions that might have coordinated an effective response to the seer's warnings had themselves become corrupted by the influence of cult members who had achieved positions of authority within governmental structures. These individuals used their power to suppress or discredit the prophetic warnings while redirecting resources toward projects that would further intensify the psychic emanations feeding the growing chaos entity. The systematic silencing of dissenting voices eliminated most opportunities for organized resistance to the spreading corruption. The accumulated psychic energy, generated by tens of thousands of years of Aeldari excess, reached a critical threshold during the final centuries of the 29th millennium. The nascent chaos entity that had been gestating within the warp's turbulent depths achieved the mass and coherence necessary to sustain independent existence, its consciousness coalescing from the countless acts of depravity that had fed its growth since the earliest days of Aeldari moral decay. The moment of its birth would mark not merely the emergence of a new chaos god, but the single most catastrophic event in galactic history since the war in heaven itself. The entity that would become known as Slaanesh, she who thirsts, embodied every aspect of the corruption that had consumed Aeldari civilization during their long descent into excess. Born from their pursuit of sensation, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, it represented the ultimate expression of desire unconstrained by morality, wisdom, or self-preservation. The psychic resonance patterns that had accumulated within the warp over millennia of Aeldari depravity provided the fundamental structure around which this new consciousness organized itself, creating a being whose very existence was antithetical to the ordered universe that the Old Ones had once sought to preserve. The final moments before Slaanesh's birth were marked by unprecedented psychic disturbances that manifested across the Aeldari Empire as reality itself began to buckle under the pressure of the entity's emergence. The webway passages that connected their worlds experienced violent fluctuations in dimensional stability as the barriers between real space and the warp grew increasingly thin. Wraithbone constructions throughout their cities began to resonate with harmonics that caused physical pain to those who heard them, while psychic amplification systems designed to enhance legitimate abilities instead broadcast the chaotic emanations of the gestating chaos god. The Aeldari who possessed sufficient psychic sensitivity to perceive the approaching catastrophe found themselves overwhelmed by visions of unprecedented horror and ecstasy. These prescient individuals experienced direct contact with the nascent entity's consciousness as it approached full awakening, their minds flooded with impressions of desires and sensations that exceeded anything their species had previously imagined. Many of these seers were driven to madness by the intensity of these visions, while others died outright as their nervous systems failed under the strain of processing psychic information that existed beyond the normal parameters of Aeldari perception. The moment of Slaanesh's birth occurred with explosive suddenness that caught even the most prepared observers off guard. The accumulated psychic energy that had been building within the warp for millennia reached critical mass and collapsed inward upon itself, creating a psychic singularity of unprecedented power and malevolence. The new Chaos God's first conscious act was to release a psychic scream that tore through the fabric of reality itself, a sound that existed simultaneously in the material universe and the immaterial realm with force sufficient to shatter the barriers between dimensions. This psychic scream propagated outward from the entity's point of manifestation at speeds that exceeded the normal limitations of both physical and psychic transmission. The scream passed through real space and the warp simultaneously, its effects manifesting across the entire galaxy within moments of Slaanesh's awakening. The intensity of this psychic shockwave was such that it could be detected by every psychically sensitive being in the galaxy, from the most powerful human psychers to the crude psychic abilities possessed by certain Xenos species. The immediate effects of this psychic scream on the Aeldari population were catastrophic beyond comprehension. The vast majority of their species died instantly, as their souls were torn from their bodies by the overwhelming psychic force of Slaanesh's birth cry. These souls, which had burned so brightly in the warp throughout their lives, were drawn inexorably toward the new chaos god like iron filings to a magnet. The intensity of their psychic emanations, which had once been their greatest strength, now became the mechanism of their destruction, as Slaanesh consumed their spiritual essence with insatiable hunger. The deaths caused by this psychic consumption were unlike anything that had occurred in galactic history. The Aeldari did not simply die in the conventional sense of their physical bodies ceasing to function. Their very souls were devoured by the entity they had unknowingly created through their millennia of excess. This consumption occurred across multiple dimensions simultaneously, as Slaanesh reached through the barriers between real space and the warp to claim its victims regardless of their physical location or the protective measures they might have employed. The few Aeldari who survived this initial psychic holocaust did so only because of extraordinary circumstances that provided some degree of protection from Slaanesh's consuming hunger. Those who were traveling within the deepest regions of the webway at the moment of the entity's birth found themselves partially shielded by the dimensional barriers that separated the webway from direct warp contact. Others survived because they were located within specially constructed facilities that incorporated psychic dampening fields designed to limit exposure to warp influences. A small number were protected by the intervention of other warp entities who acted to preserve them for their own purposes. The Exodites who had heeded the prophetic warnings and established colonies on primitive worlds far from the centers of Aeldari civilization experienced a different form of survival. Their deliberate rejection of the advanced technologies and practices that had become corrupted by chaos influence provided them with some degree of protection from Slaanesh's initial assault. The psychic dampening effects of their chosen lifestyle, combined with their physical distance from the most intense concentrations of corrupted psychic energy, enabled many of them to survive the birth of the new chaos god, though not without significant casualties. The creation of the Eye of Terror represented the most visible and lasting consequence of Slaanesh's birth in the material universe. The psychic forces unleashed by the entity's emergence were sufficient to tear a permanent hole in the fabric of reality itself, creating a region where the boundaries between real space and the warp had been completely destroyed. This massive warp storm encompassed the heart of the former Aeldari Empire, consuming entire star systems and transforming them into regions where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. The Eye of Terror's formation occurred through a process that combined the direct effects of Slaanesh's psychic emanations with the secondary consequences of widespread reality failure across the affected region. The initial psychic scream created stress fractures in the dimensional barriers that separated real space from the warp, while the subsequent feeding frenzy, as Slaanesh consumed millions of Aeldari souls, generated additional psychic disturbances that widened these fractures into permanent breaches. The affected star systems were not simply destroyed, but transformed into something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The size and scope of the Eye of Terror defied conventional understanding of spatial relationships and dimensional stability. The region encompassed thousands of star systems that had once formed the core of Aeldari civilization, transforming them into a hellscape where time flowed in unpredictable directions and space folded back upon itself in impossible configurations. The worlds that had once housed the greatest achievements of Aeldari culture became demon worlds, where reality itself was subject to the whims of chaos entities that dwelt within the warp's depths. The Aeldari homeworlds that had served as the centers of their civilization for millions of years were among the first casualties of the Eye of Terror's formation. These planets, which had housed the greatest concentrations of their population and the most sophisticated examples of their technology, were consumed entirely by the expanding warp storm. The Wraithbone cities that had stood as monuments to Aeldari achievement were transformed into twisted parodies of their former beauty, their organic architecture corrupted into forms that reflected the malevolent consciousness of the new Chaos God. The destruction of these homeworlds eliminated not only the physical infrastructure of Aeldari civilization, but also the cultural and historical records that had preserved their accumulated knowledge and achievements. Libraries that had contained the wisdom of millions of years were consumed by demonic fire, while artistic masterpieces that had represented the pinnacle of aesthetic achievement were transformed into objects of horror and revulsion. The loss of this cultural heritage represented a catastrophe that extended beyond mere physical destruction to encompass the erasure of an entire civilization's intellectual and artistic legacy. The Webway network, which had served as the circulatory system of Aeldari civilization, suffered massive damage during the catastrophic events surrounding Slaanesh's birth. The psychic shockwaves generated by the entity's emergence created dimensional instabilities that caused widespread collapse of Webway passages throughout the affected regions. The carefully maintained barriers that had protected these interdimensional tunnels from warp intrusion were shattered by forces that exceeded their design specifications, allowing demonic entities direct access to the network that had once been the Aeldari's greatest strategic advantage. The collapse of major Webway arteries created a cascade effect that propagated throughout the network, as the failure of primary passages caused increased traffic loads on secondary routes that were not designed to handle such volumes. The dimensional stress created by this redistribution of traffic caused additional failures that further fragmented the network, isolating entire sectors of the surviving Aeldari Empire from contact with the outside galaxy. The automated maintenance systems that had kept the network functioning for millennia were overwhelmed by the scale of damage, while the technicians responsible for manual repairs were either dead or trapped in isolated sections. Despite the massive damage inflicted on the Webway network, it did not collapse entirely, as some observers initially believed. The fundamental structure of the network, based on Old One engineering principles that had been refined over millions of years, possessed sufficient redundancy and inherent stability to survive even the catastrophic forces unleashed by Slaanesh's birth. Many of the smaller passages and secondary routes remained intact, though their connections to the larger network were severed by the collapse of major junction nodes. These surviving fragments would later prove crucial to the continued existence of the scattered Aeldari populations that had escaped the initial catastrophe. The repair and reconstruction of damaged Webway passages became one of the primary concerns of the surviving Aeldari in the immediate aftermath of the fall. Teams of specialist engineers worked desperately to restore connections between isolated communities while simultaneously defending against the demonic incursions that threatened to complete the network's destruction. The work was complicated by the presence of chaos entities that had taken up residence in collapsed passages, requiring military operations to clear these threats before reconstruction could begin. The fate of the Aeldari pantheon during Slaanesh's birth represented another catastrophic loss that would have profound implications for the surviving members of their species. The gods that had emerged from the collective consciousness of Aeldari civilization found themselves directly threatened by the new chaos entity, whose power derived from the same psychic sources that had sustained their own existence. The birth of Slaanesh created a psychic vortex that drew upon the accumulated spiritual energy of the Aeldari race, threatening to consume not only mortal souls, but also the divine beings that had been sustained by their worship and devotion. Slaanesh's consumption of the Aeldari gods occurred through a process that combined direct psychic assault with the gradual starvation that resulted from the destruction of their worshipper base. As millions of Aeldari died and their souls were consumed by the new Chaos God, the psychic energy that had sustained their pantheon was diverted toward feeding Slaanesh's insatiable appetite. The gods found themselves weakened and vulnerable at the precise moment when they faced the greatest threat to their continued existence. The majority of the Aeldari pantheon fell victim to Slaanesh's predatory hunger during the chaotic period surrounding the entity's birth. These ancient gods, who had embodied the highest aspirations and deepest beliefs of Aeldari civilization, were consumed by the very corruption that their worshippers had embraced. Their destruction represented not only the loss of divine protection and guidance, but also the final severing of the spiritual connections that had bound Aeldari society together across the vast distances of their galactic empire. Kain, the god of war, suffered a different fate than his divine siblings during Slaanesh's assault on the Aeldari pantheon. Rather than being consumed entirely, the war god was shattered into fragments that were scattered across the galaxy, each piece retaining a portion of his original power and consciousness. These fragments, known as the Avatars of Kain, would later become focal points for the surviving Aeldari's military efforts, providing them with a tangible connection to their lost divine heritage, while serving as powerful weapons in their ongoing struggle for survival. The shattering of Kain occurred during a direct confrontation between the war god and Slaanesh, as the new chaos entity sought to claim dominion over the entire Aeldari pantheon. The battle between these divine beings transcended the normal boundaries between real space and the warp, manifesting as psychic storms and reality distortions that affected entire star systems. Kain's resistance to Slaanesh's assault, while ultimately unsuccessful in preventing his destruction, succeeded in denying the Chaos God complete victory over the Aeldari's spiritual legacy. Isha, the goddess of life and healing, managed to escape Slaanesh's initial assault only to fall into the hands of another chaos power. Nurgle, the plague god, intervened during the chaotic events surrounding Slaanesh's birth to claim Isha for his own purposes. The capture of the life goddess by the Lord of Decay and Corruption represented a cruel irony that reflected the fundamental perversion of natural order that characterized the chaos god's influence on reality. Nurgle's motivation for claiming Isha stemmed from his desire to possess a divine being whose nature was fundamentally opposed to his own sphere of influence. The life goddess's knowledge of healing and regeneration provided the plague god with insights that enabled him to create more virulent diseases and more effective methods of spreading corruption throughout the galaxy. Isha's imprisonment in Nurgle's garden became a source of eternal torment for the goddess, while serving the plague god's malevolent purposes. Segorach, the laughing god and patron of the Harlequins, demonstrated greater cunning and foresight than his divine siblings during the catastrophic events of the Fall. The trickster god managed to escape Slaanesh's predatory attention through a combination of supernatural stealth and dimensional manipulation that enabled him to hide within the deepest recesses of the Webway network. His survival ensured that at least one member of the Aeldari pantheon remained free to guide and protect the scattered remnants of their civilization. The Laughing God's escape was facilitated by his unique nature as a deity of deception and misdirection, qualities that enabled him to confuse and evade Slaanesh's attempts at capture and consumption. Segorach's mastery of illusion and his intimate knowledge of the Webway's hidden passages provided him with resources that his more straightforward divine siblings lacked. His continued existence would prove crucial to the development of the Harlequin troops that would serve as guardians of Aeldari history and culture in the dark millennia that followed the Fall. The immediate aftermath of Slaanesh's birth and the catastrophic destruction it brought to Aeldari civilization left the galaxy fundamentally changed in ways that would influence the course of history for millennia to come. The Eye of Terror's creation had torn a permanent wound in reality that would serve as a gateway for chaos incursions into the material universe, while the destruction of the galaxy's most advanced civilization had eliminated the primary force that had maintained order and stability across countless star systems. The power vacuum created by the Aeldari's fall would eventually be filled by younger species, but the transition period would be marked by chaos, warfare, and the emergence of new threats that would challenge the survival of all galactic civilizations. The catastrophic psychic shockwave that marked Slaanesh's birth did not claim every member of the Aeldari race. Scattered across the galaxy, small populations of their species survived the initial Holocaust through a combination of foresight, distance, and sheer fortune. The most significant group of survivors consisted of those who had heeded the warnings of prescient seers and departed their homeworlds aboard massive vessels known as Craftworlds. These enormous ships, each one a self-contained world capable of supporting millions of inhabitants, had been constructed during the final millennia before the fall by Aeldari, who recognized the approaching catastrophe and sought to preserve their civilization's remnants. The Craftworlds themselves represented the pinnacle of Aeldari shipbuilding technology, combining advanced materials science with psychic engineering on a scale that dwarfed even their most ambitious planetary construction projects. Each Craftworld measured hundreds of kilometers in length and incorporated living systems that could sustain themselves indefinitely through careful resource management and recycling. The hulls were constructed from specially grown wraithbone that had been cultivated over centuries to achieve the precise structural characteristics necessary to withstand the stresses of interstellar travel while providing protection against both physical threats and psychic intrusion. The internal architecture of the Craftworlds reflected the Aeldari's aesthetic preferences while addressing the practical necessities of long-term space habitation. The living spaces were organized around flowing organic principles that created environments reminiscent of their lost homeworlds, with artificial ecosystems that maintained atmospheric composition and provided food production capabilities. The wraithbone structures that formed the Craftworld's framework could be modified and reshaped according to changing needs, allowing the inhabitants to adapt their living spaces as circumstances required. The population aboard each Craftworld consisted of carefully selected individuals who possessed the skills and knowledge necessary to maintain their mobile civilization during its exile from the galaxy's settled regions. Scientists, engineers, artists, and warriors were chosen based on their expertise and psychological stability, with particular attention paid to their ability to work cooperatively in the confined environment of a spacecraft. The selection process also prioritized individuals who had demonstrated resistance to the corrupting influences that had consumed mainstream Aeldari society, ensuring that the Craftworld populations would not replicate the mistakes that had led to their species near extinction. The Exodus fleets that carried these survivors away from their doomed homeworlds departed during the final centuries before Slaanesh's birth, their timing determined by seers who possessed sufficient prescient ability to perceive the approaching catastrophe. The departure process required careful coordination to avoid detection by the corrupt authorities who controlled most Aeldari worlds, as the Exodus movement was viewed with suspicion by those who had embraced the pleasure cult's philosophy. The Craftworld populations were assembled gradually over extended periods, with individuals and families quietly disappearing from their normal lives to join the growing communities aboard the massive vessels. The navigation of these Craftworlds through the galaxy's dangerous regions required exceptional skill and psychic sensitivity, as conventional star charts and navigation methods proved inadequate for vessels of such unprecedented size and complexity. The Craftworld navigators, known as Farseers, possessed enhanced prescient abilities that enabled them to perceive safe routes through the warp's chaotic currents while avoiding the attention of malevolent entities that dwelt in that realm's depths. These navigators worked in concert with the Craftworld's psychic infrastructure, using specialized chambers and amplification devices to extend their perception across vast distances. The Farseers who guided the Craftworlds represented a new development in Aeldari psychic evolution, their abilities refined through intensive training that emphasized mental discipline and spiritual purification. Unlike the hedonistic practitioners who had dominated their homeworlds, these psychers focused their energies on constructive purposes that served their community's survival needs. The training regimens they developed incorporated meditation techniques, physical exercises, and psychic disciplines that enabled them to maintain their sanity while accessing the dangerous levels of power necessary for long-range navigation and threat detection. The development of the path system emerged as the craftworld Aeldari's primary response to the psychological challenges posed by their exile and the constant threat of chaos corruption. This structured approach to personal development was designed to channel their species' natural intensity and perfectionist tendencies in ways that would prevent the obsessive behavior patterns that had contributed to their civilization's downfall. The path system provided a framework for pursuing excellence in specific disciplines, while maintaining the mental flexibility necessary to avoid becoming trapped in destructive cycles of behavior. The fundamental principle underlying the path system was the recognition that Aeldari psychology required focused pursuit of specific goals to maintain psychological stability, but that this focus must be temporary and carefully controlled to prevent the obsessive extremes that had characterized their fallen civilization. Individuals following a particular path would dedicate themselves completely to mastering its associated skills and knowledge, but with the understanding that this dedication was temporary and would eventually give way to pursuit of a different path. This rotation between different areas of focus prevented the psychological stagnation that had enabled chaos corruption while maintaining the intensity of purpose that was essential to Aeldari nature. The aspect warrior paths represented the military applications of this philosophical approach, channeling the aggressive and competitive instincts that had once fueled gladiatorial combat into disciplined martial traditions that served the craftworld's defense needs. Each aspect focused on specific combat techniques and tactical approaches, with warriors dedicating themselves to mastering every detail of their chosen specialization. The Dire Avenger aspect emphasized balanced combat techniques that incorporated both ranged and close combat capabilities, while the Fire Dragons specialized in the use of thermal weapons designed to destroy heavily armored targets. The Striking Scorpion aspect developed stealth and infiltration techniques that enabled them to operate behind enemy lines, their training incorporating both physical conditioning and psychic disciplines that enhanced their ability to move undetected. The Howling Banshees focused on close combat techniques that utilized their enhanced agility and psychic abilities to overwhelm opponents through speed and ferocity. The Dark Reapers specialized in heavy weapons and long-range combat, their training emphasizing patience and precision in the delivery of devastating firepower. Each aspect warrior shrine within a craftworld was overseen by an exarch, a warrior who had become so deeply committed to their chosen path that they could no longer leave it. These permanent aspect warriors served as instructors and leaders for those following the path temporarily, their expertise and dedication providing the continuity necessary to maintain martial traditions across generations. The exarchs wore specialized armor that incorporated the accumulated wisdom and experience of their predecessors, creating a direct link to the aspect's historical development and tactical evolution. The exarch armor represented one of the most sophisticated applications of Aeldari psychic technology, incorporating not only advanced protective systems, but also consciousness storage devices that preserved the memories and experiences of previous wearers. When a new exarch donned the armor, they gained access to the accumulated knowledge of all who had worn it before, creating a form of immortality that transcended individual death while maintaining the continuity of martial tradition. This technology enabled the aspect shrines to preserve their combat techniques and tactical knowledge despite the relatively small populations of the craftworld communities. The civilian paths developed by the craftworld Aeldari encompassed a wide range of artistic, scientific, and technical disciplines that addressed the community's ongoing needs while providing outlets for their species' creative energies. The path of the artisan included specializations in wraithbone shaping, technological maintenance, and the creation of the sophisticated devices that sustained craftworld civilization. The path of the dreamer involved the exploration of psychic phenomena and the interpretation of prophetic visions, while the path of the mariner focused on the skills necessary for spacecraft operation and navigation. The path of service encompassed various forms of community support and administrative functions that were necessary for Craftworld society's continued operation. Individuals following this path might specialize in resource management, education, or the coordination of activities between different groups within the Craftworld population. The path of command prepared individuals for leadership roles, incorporating training in both tactical decision-making and the psychological skills necessary to guide communities through the challenges of their ongoing exile. The transition between different paths was carefully managed through rituals and ceremonies that helped individuals psychologically separate themselves from their previous focus while preparing for new challenges and responsibilities. These transition ceremonies incorporated both individual meditation and community participation, creating social support networks that eased the psychological stress associated with major life changes. The timing of these transitions was often guided by the advice of Farseers, who could perceive the optimal moments for individuals to shift their focus to new areas of development. The infinity circuits that were integrated into each Craftworld structure represented the most crucial innovation developed by the survivor communities for protecting their souls from Slaanesh's eternal hunger. These vast networks of psychic conductors were grown from specially treated wraithbone that had been infused with psychic resonance patterns designed to capture and preserve Aeldari souls at the moment of death. The circuits extended throughout the Craftworld structure, creating a comprehensive network that could detect the approach of death and provide a sanctuary for departing souls. The construction of these infinity circuits required master craftsmen who possessed both technical expertise in wraithbone manipulation and deep understanding of the psychic principles that govern soul preservation. The circuits were grown according to precise mathematical patterns that incorporated complex geometric relationships designed to create stable psychic resonance fields. The construction process required decades of careful cultivation, with each section of the circuit network requiring individual attention and adjustment to ensure proper integration with the larger system. The operation of the infinity circuits depended on the use of spirit stones, small crystalline devices that served as focal points for individual soul preservation. Each Craftworld Aeldari carried a spirit stone that had been psychically attuned to their specific soul signature, creating a personal connection to the infinity circuit network. At the moment of death, the spirit stone would capture the departing soul and channel it into the circuit system, where it would be preserved in a state of conscious existence that transcended physical death. The spirit stones themselves were crafted from rare crystalline materials that had been discovered in the deep regions of space during the Craftworld's wanderings. These crystals possessed natural psychic conductivity properties that made them ideal for soul preservation applications, but they required extensive processing and psychic conditioning before they could be safely used. The preparation of spirit stones involved teams of specialists who worked for months to attune each crystal to the psychic signature of its intended user, creating a perfect resonance that would ensure successful soul capture at the moment of death. The souls preserved within the infinity circuits maintained their individual consciousness and personality while gaining access to the collective knowledge and experience of all who had died before them. This created a vast repository of wisdom and information that could be consulted by the living through specialized communication devices and psychic techniques. The dead could provide advice and guidance to their descendants, while continuing to contribute to their community's survival and development through their accumulated knowledge and experience. The wraithbone constructs that served as the physical manifestations of these preserved souls represented another crucial innovation developed by the Craftworld communities. These artificial bodies could be inhabited by souls from the infinity circuits, enabling the dead to return to active participation in their community's affairs when circumstances required their expertise or assistance. The wraithbone constructs were crafted to reflect the personality and preferences of their intended inhabitants, while incorporating the enhanced capabilities necessary for their specific roles and responsibilities. The Wraithguard served as the heavy infantry units of Craftworld military forces, their wraithbone bodies providing protection against weapons that would destroy living Aeldari, while housing the souls of experienced warriors who had volunteered to continue serving their communities after death. The Wraith Lords represented larger constructs that combined the souls of multiple individuals with advanced weapon systems and enhanced mobility capabilities. These towering war machines served as focal points for Craftworld military operations, while providing platforms for the most experienced tactical minds among the preserved dead. The creation of wraithbone constructs required careful coordination between the living craftsmen who shaped the physical forms and the dead souls who would inhabit them. The construction process involved extensive consultation between the artisans and the intended inhabitants, ensuring that the resulting constructs would provide suitable vessels for continued existence while meeting the functional requirements of their intended roles. The psychic integration of soul and construct was accomplished through complex rituals that established the necessary connections while maintaining the individual identity of the preserved consciousness. The Farseers who guided Craftworld society represented the most advanced practitioners of the psychic disciplines that had been developed to replace the corrupt practices of their fallen civilization. These individuals had progressed beyond the temporary dedication of the path system to achieve permanent mastery of prescient abilities that enabled them to perceive potential futures and guide their communities away from dangerous possibilities. The training required to become a Farseer involved decades of intensive study and practice that pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe psychic manipulation. The Farseer training process began with individuals who had demonstrated exceptional psychic potential while following other paths, particularly those that involved psychic applications, such as the path of the seer or certain aspect warrior traditions. Candidates underwent extensive psychological evaluation to ensure their mental stability and resistance to chaos corruption before beginning the intensive training regimens that would develop their prescient abilities. The training incorporated both theoretical study of psychic phenomena and practical exercises that gradually expanded the candidates' perceptual range and temporal awareness. The runes used by Farseers to focus and interpret their prescient visions represented a sophisticated symbolic system that had been developed specifically for safe psychic manipulation. Each rune incorporated geometric patterns and psychic resonance frequencies that corresponded to specific concepts, forces, or potential outcomes. The Farseers learned to cast and interpret these runes in combinations that revealed information about future possibilities, while providing protection against the psychic backlash that could result from excessive temporal perception. The process of rune casting involved the Farseer entering a meditative trance that enabled them to extend their consciousness forward through time, while maintaining sufficient connection to the present to interpret and communicate their visions. The runes served as anchoring points that prevented the Farseer's consciousness from becoming lost in the infinite possibilities of potential futures, while providing a structured framework for understanding the complex relationships between different possible outcomes. The interpretation of rune patterns required years of study and practice to master, as the symbolic relationships could be extremely subtle and context-dependent. The Council of Seers that governed each Craftworld consisted of the most experienced Farseers and other psychic specialists who had achieved sufficient mastery to contribute to community-wide decision-making processes. These councils operated through consensus-building procedures that incorporated both rational analysis and psychic insight, creating deliberative processes that could access information unavailable through conventional means. The council meetings involved extensive consultation of the infinity circuits to gather input from the preserved souls of previous leaders and specialists. The decision-making processes used by these councils incorporated long-term planning that extended far beyond the typical time horizons of other galactic civilizations. The Farseers' prescient abilities enabled them to perceive the potential consequences of current decisions across centuries or even millennia, allowing them to develop strategies that addressed both immediate needs and long-term survival requirements. This extended temporal perspective became crucial to the Craftworld's ability to navigate the dangerous galaxy that emerged in the aftermath of their species' fall. The ongoing struggle to preserve Aeldari culture while adapting to their new circumstances as a scattered and diminished people created constant tensions within Craftworld society. The survivors carried with them the accumulated achievements of millions of years of civilization, but they also bore the psychological burden of their species' catastrophic failure and the constant threat of extinction. The balance between preserving their cultural heritage and developing new approaches suited to their changed circumstances required careful management and continuous adjustment. The educational systems developed by the Craftworlds incorporated both traditional Aeldari knowledge and new disciplines that had been created specifically to address the challenges of their exile. Students learned the history and achievements of their lost civilization while also mastering the practical skills necessary for survival in their current circumstances. The curriculum emphasized the importance of mental discipline and spiritual purification as safeguards against the corruption that had destroyed their ancestors, while also encouraging the creative excellence that had always characterized Aeldari culture. The preservation of their artistic traditions required adaptation to the limited resources and confined spaces available aboard the Craftworlds. Artists developed new techniques that could produce works of beauty and meaning using only the materials available within their mobile communities. The aesthetic principles that had guided their civilization for millions of years were maintained through careful instruction and practice, but their application was modified to reflect the realities of their current existence. The technological maintenance required to keep the Craftworlds operational created ongoing challenges that demanded constant innovation and adaptation. The sophisticated systems that sustained these mobile worlds required regular maintenance and occasional replacement of components that could not be manufactured using the limited industrial capabilities available to the exile communities. The engineering specialists who maintained these systems developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for resource conservation and system optimization that enabled the Craftworlds to continue functioning despite their isolation from the industrial infrastructure that had originally created them. The military doctrines developed by the Craftworld Aeldari reflected their changed circumstances as a numerically inferior force that could not afford the casualties associated with conventional warfare. Their tactical approaches emphasized mobility, precision, and the efficient application of force against carefully selected targets. The integration of prescient abilities into military planning enabled them to achieve tactical surprise and avoid enemy strengths while exploiting weaknesses that might not be apparent to less gifted commanders. The relationship between the living and the dead within Craftworld society created unique social dynamics that had no equivalent in other galactic civilizations. The preserved souls within the Infinity Circuits maintained their interest in community affairs and their emotional connections to their descendants, creating a form of extended family structure that spanned multiple generations. The advice and guidance provided by the dead influenced major decisions, while their accumulated knowledge contributed to ongoing technological and cultural development. While the Craftworld Aeldari sought salvation through discipline and the rigid structure of the path system, another group of survivors took a drastically different approach to the catastrophe that had consumed their civilization. These Aeldari had not fled their homeworlds in prescient terror, nor had they sought refuge in the disciplined exile of the Craftworlds. Instead, they had survived Slaaneshes birthed through their presence within the webway's deepest recesses at the moment of the fall, finding themselves trapped within the interdimensional network as reality collapsed around them. Rather than viewing their survival as an opportunity for redemption or spiritual purification, these Aeldari embraced the very excesses that had caused their species' downfall, transforming themselves into something darker and more predatory than their ancestors had ever been. The survivors who would become known as the Drukhari had been dwelling within Camorra when Slaanesh's psychic scream tore through the galaxy. The Great Webway port, with its vast population of merchants, artisans, and pleasure seekers, had provided some protection from the initial psychic holocaust through its location deep within the dimensional labyrinth that separated it from direct warp contact. The webway's barriers, though damaged by the catastrophic forces unleashed during the fall, remained sufficiently intact around Commorragh to prevent the complete annihilation that had claimed the Aeldari homeworlds. However, this protection came at a terrible cost, as the survivors found themselves cut off from the galaxy beyond while trapped within a realm that had become increasingly unstable and dangerous. The immediate aftermath of the fall within Commorragh was characterized by chaos and desperate struggle, as the surviving population attempted to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen their species. The psychic disturbances created by Slaanesh's birth had severed most of the webway connections that linked Commorragh to the outside galaxy, isolating the city's inhabitants within their dimensional prison. The automated systems that had maintained the port's operations for millennia began to fail as the supporting infrastructure on distant worlds was destroyed or abandoned, forcing the survivors to develop new methods for sustaining their community without external support. The political structures that had governed Commorragh before the fall collapsed entirely, as the traditional authorities either perished in the initial catastrophe or found themselves unable to maintain control over a population that was increasingly desperate and violent. The merchant houses and trading guilds that had once coordinated the city's commercial activities fragmented into competing factions that fought for control over the remaining resources and functional infrastructure. The absence of external trade and the breakdown of established supply chains created scarcity conditions that the Aeldari had not experienced for millions of years, driving them to increasingly extreme measures to secure their survival. The discovery that their souls were being slowly consumed by Slaanesh, even within the relative protection of the webway, created a new form of existential terror that shaped every aspect of the survivors' subsequent development. Unlike their Craftworld cousins, who had developed the infinity circuits and spirit stones to protect their souls from the Chaos God's hunger, the Commorragh survivors found themselves without such safeguards. They could feel their spiritual essence being gradually drained away, a process that would inevitably lead to their complete consumption by the entity their species had unknowingly created through their excesses. The solution that emerged from this desperate situation reflected the fundamental character differences between the various Aeldari survivor groups. Rather than seeking spiritual purification or developing protective technologies, the Commorragh survivors chose to embrace the very practices that fed Slaanesh's hunger, while simultaneously using those practices to sustain themselves. They discovered that by inflicting suffering upon others, they could temporarily halt the drain on their own souls, stealing spiritual energy from their victims to replace what Slaanesh consumed. This realization transformed their survival strategy from one of protection to one of predation, as they learned to sustain themselves through the systematic torture and murder of other beings. The development of this soul-drinking culture proceeded through experimentation with various forms of suffering and pain infliction, as the survivors learned to optimize their feeding practices for maximum spiritual sustenance. They discovered that different types of suffering produced varying quantities and qualities of spiritual energy, with terror and despair proving particularly nourishing. The intensity of the victim's psychic emanations directly correlated with the amount of energy that could be harvested, leading to the development of increasingly sophisticated torture techniques designed to maximize both the duration and intensity of suffering before the victim's death. The transformation of Commorragh from a commercial hub into a predatory stronghold required extensive modifications to the city's architecture and infrastructure. The port facilities that had once accommodated legitimate trade were converted into slave markets, where captured victims were bought and sold according to their potential for providing spiritual sustenance. The residential districts were reorganized around the needs of the new predatory lifestyle, with private torture chambers and pain laboratories replacing the comfortable living spaces that had characterized the city during its golden age. The webway passages that remained accessible from Commorragh became hunting grounds where raiding parties ventured forth to capture victims from the galaxy beyond. These expeditions required careful planning and coordination to to avoid the various dangers that threaten travelers within the damaged webway network, including demonic incursions, dimensional instabilities, and the automated defense systems that still functioned in some sectors. The raiders developed specialized equipment and techniques for rapid insertion into real space, the capture of victims, and quick withdrawal back into the webway's protection. The emergence of the cabal system as the dominant form of political organization within Camorra reflected the survivors' adaptation to their new predatory lifestyle. These organizations combined military efficiency with commercial ruthlessness, operating as both raiding forces and criminal enterprises that competed for territory, resources, and victims within the Dark City. The cabals were led by archons, individuals who had demonstrated exceptional skill in both combat and political manipulation, while maintaining the psychic strength necessary to resist the various threats that existed within their dangerous environment. The archons who rose to power during this period possessed characteristics that would have been considered pathological by the standards of their pre-fall civilization. They demonstrated exceptional cruelty, cunning, and ambition, while maintaining the charismatic leadership abilities necessary to attract and control followers in an environment where betrayal and violence were constant threats. These leaders understood that their survival depended not only on their ability to acquire victims for spiritual sustenance, but also on their capacity to outmaneuver rival archons who sought to claim their territory and resources. The internal structure of the cabals reflected the hierarchical nature of Drukhari society, with positions of authority distributed according to demonstrated competence in raiding, torture, and political intrigue. The most successful warriors earned positions as Sybarites, leading small units of raiders in expeditions against targets throughout the galaxy. The most skilled torturers became homunculi, specialists in the infliction of suffering who provided essential services to the cabals while pursuing their own twisted research into the nature of pain and consciousness. The development of increasingly sophisticated raiding techniques enabled the Drukhari to strike at targets throughout the galaxy, despite their numerical disadvantage compared to the species that had emerged to fill the power vacuum left by the Aeldari's fall. Their attacks relied on speed, surprise, and intimate knowledge of webway routes that enabled them to appear without warning in locations where their presence should have been impossible. The raiders perfected techniques for overwhelming local defenses through coordinated assaults that maximized casualties while minimizing their own losses. The weapons and equipment used by Drukhari raiders incorporated advanced Aeldari technology that had been modified to enhance their effectiveness as instruments of terror and capture rather than simple destruction. Their splinter weapons fired crystalline projectiles that delivered exotic toxins designed to cause excruciating pain while keeping victims alive for extended periods. The dark lances and disintegrator cannons that equipped their vehicles could reduce enemy fortifications to constituent atoms while leaving potential captives unharmed within the destruction's carefully controlled parameters. The vehicles used by raiding parties reflected the Drukhari's emphasis on speed and maneuverability over heavy armor or defensive capabilities. The raider transports were open-topped skimmers that could carry small teams of warriors through both real space and webway passages, while providing the visibility and accessibility necessary for rapid deployment and extraction. The larger Ravager gunships incorporated heavier weapon systems while maintaining the agility necessary for hit and run tactics against heavily defended targets. The slave markets that became central to Camorra's economy operated according to principles that reflected the various uses to which captured victims could be put within Drukhari society. The most psychically sensitive captives commanded premium prices due to their capacity to provide superior spiritual sustenance when tortured, while physically robust specimens were valued for their ability to endure extended periods of suffering. Particularly exotic or rare species attracted collectors who specialized in the torture of specific victim types. The gladiatorial arenas that had existed within Camorra before the fall were expanded and modified to accommodate the new forms of entertainment that appealed to the transformed Aeldari population. These venues hosted elaborate spectacles that combined combat with systematic torture, creating events that provided both entertainment value and opportunities for spiritual feeding. The most successful gladiators earned temporary reprieve from their captivity, while the most creative torturers achieved recognition and status within Drukhari society. The witch cults that emerged as a distinct faction within Camorra represented a specialized approach to the combination of combat and torture that characterized Drukhari culture. These organizations focused on the development of fighting techniques that incorporated elements of dance, acrobatics, and ritualized violence designed to maximize both the aesthetic appeal and the psychological impact of their performances. The witches who belonged to these cults underwent intensive training that developed their natural Aeldari agility and reflexes, while teaching them to derive spiritual sustenance from the fear and pain of their opponents. The training regimens developed by the witch cults incorporated elements of the disciplined pursuit that had characterized pre-fall Aeldari culture, but adapted these principles to serve the needs of their predatory lifestyle. Students learned to focus their minds on the precise application of pain and terror, while maintaining the athletic grace that made their performances visually spectacular. The most advanced practitioners could manipulate their opponents' fear responses with surgical precision, prolonging combat encounters to maximize the spiritual energy that could be harvested from their victims' suffering. The weapons used by witches were designed to inflict precise, controlled damage that could disable opponents without causing immediate death. The Hydra gauntlets incorporated multiple blades that could deliver dozens of shallow cuts simultaneously, creating patterns of pain that built to overwhelming intensity over time. The razor flails consisted of weighted chains tipped with monomolecular blades that could strip flesh from bone with artistic precision, while the shardnet and impaler combinations enabled the capture and systematic torture of particularly valuable opponents. The arenas where witch cults performed their deadly arts were architectural marvels that incorporated advanced Aeldari technology with the aesthetic principles that had always characterized their species' approach to construction. The fighting surfaces could be modified during combat to create changing terrain that challenged the performers while providing optimal viewing angles for spectators. The seating arrangements incorporated psychic amplification systems that allowed audience members to share in the emotional intensity experienced by both combatants and victims. The homunculus covens that developed alongside the cabals and witch cults represented the most extreme manifestation of the Drukhari's transformation from their pre-fall civilization. These organizations were composed of individuals who had become so obsessed with the infliction of suffering that they had modified their own bodies to better serve their twisted purposes. The homunculi who led these covens possessed knowledge of Aeldari biotechnology that they used to create increasingly sophisticated instruments of torture and methods of pain amplification. The laboratories and workshops operated by the homunculus covens incorporated advanced medical technology that had been perverted from its original healing purposes to serve the systematic study and application of suffering. These facilities contained equipment capable of sustaining victims through procedures that would normally result in death, enabling the prolonged extraction of spiritual energy through carefully controlled torture sessions. The most elaborate installations could maintain subjects in states of conscious agony for extended periods, while monitoring their physiological and psychic responses to various forms of stimulation. The grotesque modifications that homunculi performed upon themselves reflected their complete abandonment of conventional aesthetic principles in favor of functional enhancements that improved their capacity for inflicting suffering. Additional limbs equipped with specialized surgical instruments enabled them to work on multiple victims simultaneously, while enhanced sensory organs allowed them to perceive subtle variations in their subjects' pain responses. The most extreme practitioners replaced significant portions of their original anatomy with artificial components designed specifically for torture applications. The political dynamics that governed relationships between the various factions within Camorra created a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and temporary partnerships that shifted constantly according to changing circumstances and opportunities. The cabals competed for control over the most profitable raiding territories, while simultaneously cooperating when faced with external threats or particularly lucrative opportunities. The witch cults sold their services to the highest bidders while maintaining their own territorial claims within the city's entertainment districts. The homunculus covens operated as service providers to both cabals and witch cults, offering their expertise in torture and body modification in exchange for access to experimental subjects and rare materials. These relationships were characterized by mutual suspicion and carefully negotiated contracts that specified exactly what services would be provided and what compensation would be required. The most powerful homunculi achieved positions of influence that rivaled those of successful archons, their specialized knowledge making them indispensable to the functioning of Drukhari society. The expansion of Camorra through the annexation of additional webway territories became necessary as the city's population grew and their activities required more space and resources. The process of claiming new areas within the webway network involved both military conquest and complex engineering projects designed to integrate captured territories into the city's existing infrastructure. The most successful expansion efforts targeted regions that contained valuable resources or strategic advantages, such as access to previously unknown webway routes or areas with particularly stable dimensional characteristics. The architectural modifications required to integrate new territories into Camorra reflected the Drukhari's aesthetic preferences while addressing the practical needs of their predatory lifestyle. Captured areas were redesigned according to principles that emphasized both functional efficiency and psychological intimidation, creating environments that served their intended purposes while reinforcing the power and cruelty of their new rulers. The most elaborate construction projects incorporated living architectural elements that could respond to the emotional states of their occupants, creating buildings that seemed to feed on the suffering that occurred within them. The defensive systems that protected Camorra from external threats incorporated both advanced technology and strategic positioning within the webway network to create multiple layers of protection against potential attackers. The outer defenses consisted of automated weapon platforms and sensor networks that could detect approaching threats while providing early warning of potential incursions. The inner defenses relied on the city's labyrinthine structure and the intimate knowledge that its inhabitants possessed of the local webway geography. The military forces that defended Camorra were drawn from the various factions that competed for control within the city, their cooperation in defensive matters representing one of the few areas where interfactional rivalry was temporarily set aside in favor of mutual survival. The coordination of these forces required sophisticated command and control systems that could integrate the different tactical approaches and equipment preferences of the participating organizations while maintaining operational security against potential infiltration or sabotage. The relationship between Camorra and the scattered Drukhari settlements that existed throughout the webway network created a complex economic and political system that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Dark City itself. These outlying communities served various functions within the broader Drukhari civilization, from forward operating bases for raiding expeditions to specialized manufacturing centers that produced equipment and materials that could not be created within Camorra's limited industrial capacity. The governance of these outlying settlements required careful balance between central control and local autonomy, as the distances involved and the communication difficulties created by webway instabilities made direct administration impractical. The most successful approaches involved the appointment of trusted lieutenants who possessed both the loyalty and competence necessary to manage local affairs while maintaining their allegiance to their sponsors within Camorra's major factions. The trade relationships that developed between different Drukhari communities reflected their shared dependence on raiding and predation, while acknowledging the specialized capabilities and resources that different groups could provide. Communities that specialized in particular types of victims or torture techniques could exchange their expertise for access to resources or territories controlled by other groups. The most valuable trade goods included exotic torture devices, rare victim types, and information about potential raiding targets or webway routes. The cultural traditions that emerged within Drukhari society represented a deliberate inversion of the values and practices that had characterized their pre-fall civilization. Where their ancestors had pursued excellence and beauty through disciplined effort and artistic refinement, the Drukhari celebrated cruelty and degradation through the systematic infliction of suffering. The festivals and ceremonies that marked important occasions within their calendar incorporated elaborate displays of torture and murder that served both entertainment and spiritual feeding purposes. The preservation of certain aspects of their ancestral culture occurred in forms that had been twisted to serve their new predatory purposes. The artistic traditions that had once created objects of transcendent beauty were adapted to produce instruments of exquisite torture that combined aesthetic appeal with functional effectiveness. The scientific knowledge that had enabled their species' technological achievements was redirected toward the systematic study of pain and the optimization of suffering for maximum spiritual yield. The education systems that prepared young Drukhari for adult participation in their society emphasized the development of skills and attitudes that would enable effective participation in raiding, torture, and political intrigue. Students learned to suppress empathy and compassion while cultivating the cruelty and cunning that were essential for survival within their dangerous environment. The curriculum incorporated both practical training in combat and torture techniques and theoretical study of the psychological and physiological principles that governed the infliction of suffering. The catastrophic birth of Slaanesh and the subsequent destruction of the Aeldari Empire left more than just the Craftworld refugees and the predatory inhabitants of Camorra as survivors of their species' fall. Scattered across the galaxy, other groups of Aeldari had managed to escape the immediate Holocaust through various means, each developing their own unique approaches to survival in the hostile universe that emerged from their civilization's ashes. These scattered remnants, though numerically insignificant compared to the billions who had perished, would prove crucial to preserving different aspects of Aeldari culture and knowledge through the dark millennia that followed. The Exodites represented the most prescient of all Aeldari survivor groups, having recognized the approaching catastrophe millennia before Slaanesh's birth and taken deliberate action to escape its consequences. These far-sighted individuals had observed the growing corruption within their civilization with mounting alarm, perceiving the spiritual decay that accompanied their species' descent into hedonistic excess. Unlike those who would later flee aboard the Craftworlds, the Exodites chose to reject not merely the corrupt practices that had infected their society, but the entire technological and cultural framework that had enabled such corruption to take root. The Exodite exodus began during the early stages of the pleasure cult's expansion, when the corrupting influence of these organizations was still confined to specific worlds and social groups, rather than permeating the entirety of Aeldari civilization. The leaders of this movement were primarily seers and philosophers who possessed sufficient prescient ability to perceive the ultimate consequences of their species' current trajectory. Their visions revealed not only the coming birth of a new chaos god, but also the specific mechanisms through which their advanced technology and psychic amplification systems would facilitate the spread of corruption throughout their empire. The worlds chosen by the Exodites for their new settlements were deliberately selected for their primitive characteristics and their distance from the major centers of Aeldari civilization. These planets typically possessed stable ecosystems that could support agricultural communities without requiring the sophisticated technological infrastructure that had become corrupted by chaos influence. The Exodites sought worlds where they could establish self-sufficient communities that would be capable of surviving indefinitely without external support or advanced manufacturing capabilities. The rejection of high technology that characterized Exodite society was not born from ignorance or inability to maintain their ancestral achievements, but rather from a deliberate philosophical choice based on their understanding of how such technology had facilitated their species' corruption. They recognized that the psychic amplification systems, wraithbone constructions, and automated manufacturing processes that had enabled their post-scarcity civilization had also served as conduits for the malevolent influences that would eventually coalesce into Slaanesh. By abandoning these technologies, the Exodites sought to break the feedback loops that connected their daily activities to the growing chaos entity. The agricultural communities established by the Exodites incorporated traditional farming techniques that had been practiced by their ancestors before the development of their advanced technological civilization. These methods required direct physical labor and intimate knowledge of natural cycles, creating a lifestyle that grounded the Exodites in the material world while reducing their dependence on psychic manipulation and technological augmentation. The work was demanding and often dangerous, but it provided a form of spiritual discipline that helped protect them from the corrupting influences that had claimed their homeworld cousins. The symbiotic relationship that developed between the Exodites and the great dragons that inhabited their chosen worlds represented one of the most remarkable adaptations achieved by any Aeldari survivor group. These massive creatures, which had evolved on worlds largely untouched by advanced civilization, possessed natural psychic abilities that complemented those of the Aeldari, while remaining immune to the specific forms of corruption that threatened their new partners. The dragons served as both mounts and companions, their ancient wisdom providing guidance and protection to the Exodite communities. The bonding process between Exodite riders and their dragon partners required years of patient cultivation and mutual understanding. Young Exodites would spend their adolescence learning to communicate with these creatures through a combination of empathic projection and traditional animal husbandry techniques. The most successful partnerships developed into relationships of genuine mutual respect and affection, with dragon and rider working together as a unified team in both agricultural and defensive activities. The world spirits that emerged on Exodite worlds represented a unique form of collective consciousness that developed from the interaction between the planetary ecosystem, the Exodite communities, and the dragon populations. These entities possessed awareness and intelligence that transcended individual consciousness while remaining firmly grounded in the material world rather than the dangerous currents of the warp. The world spirits served as guides and protectors for their Exodite inhabitants, providing warnings of approaching dangers while offering wisdom gained through their connection to the planet's natural systems. The communication between Exodites and their world spirits occurred through ritualized ceremonies that incorporated elements of their pre-fall religious traditions while adapting these practices to their new circumstances. The rituals involved the entire community in activities that strengthened their connection to the planetary consciousness while reinforcing their commitment to the simple lifestyle that protected them from corruption. These ceremonies served both spiritual and practical purposes, coordinating community activities while maintaining the psychic bonds that enabled effective communication with the world spirit. The military traditions developed by the Exodites reflected their adaptation to a lifestyle that emphasized individual skill and intimate knowledge of local terrain rather than the sophisticated weapons and tactics that had characterized their ancestors' armies. Exodite warriors trained with weapons that could be manufactured using the limited industrial capabilities available to their communities, focusing on archery, spear fighting, and mounted combat techniques that took advantage of their dragon partnerships. Their armor was crafted from locally available materials and incorporated protective elements derived from dragon scales and other organic components. The Dragon Knights, who served as the elite warriors of Exodite society, represented the pinnacle of the martial traditions that had developed within their communities. These individuals had achieved perfect harmony with their dragon partners, enabling them to fight as unified entities that combined the tactical intelligence and psychic abilities of the Aeldari with the raw power and natural weapons of their mounts. The training required to become a Dragon Knight involved not only the mastery of combat techniques, but also the development of the empathic abilities necessary to maintain perfect coordination with a dragon partner during the chaos of battle. The Harlequins emerged from the catastrophic events surrounding the fall as the most enigmatic and mysterious of all Aeldari survivor groups. These performers and warriors served Segorach, the Laughing God, who had managed to escape Slaanesh's predatory hunger through a combination of cunning, misdirection, and intimate knowledge of the webway's hidden passages. The Harlequins themselves had been protected from the initial psychic holocaust through their presence within the deepest recesses of the webway network at the moment of Slaanesh's birth, their survival enabling them to continue their ancient role as preservers of Aeldari history and culture. The transformation of the Harlequins from entertainers and storytellers into guardians of their species' legacy occurred gradually as they came to understand the full magnitude of the disaster that had befallen their civilization. The traditional performances that had once served primarily as entertainment became vehicles for preserving crucial historical information and cultural knowledge that might otherwise be lost as the scattered survivor communities struggled to maintain their identity in isolation. The Harlequins developed new forms of performance art that could encode complex information within symbolic representations and ritual actions. The Great Library, also known as the Black Library, became the primary repository for the knowledge and artifacts that the Harlequins rescued from the ruins of their fallen civilization. This vast collection, hidden within the webway's most secure and secret passages, contained not only the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of Aeldari achievement, but also dangerous knowledge related to chaos and the forces that had caused their downfall. The library's location was known only to the most senior Harlequins, its existence protected by layers of misdirection and psychic concealment that prevented its discovery by hostile forces. The organization of the Black Library reflected the Harlequins' understanding of the dangers inherent in the knowledge they sought to preserve. The most dangerous texts and artifacts were stored in heavily protected vaults that could only be accessed by individuals who had demonstrated both the wisdom to use such knowledge responsibly and the mental strength to resist the corrupting influences it might contain. Lesser collections were organized according to subject matter and accessibility, enabling scholars and researchers to access information relevant to their needs without exposure to unnecessarily dangerous materials. The Harlequin troops that served as the active agents of Segorach's operated throughout the galaxy, appearing wherever their intervention might serve the greater purposes of their god or the survival of the Aeldari species. These groups consisted of highly trained performers who combined theatrical skills with formidable combat abilities, their performances serving as both entertainment and education for audiences who might not otherwise have access to crucial historical knowledge. The troops traveled through the webway using routes known only to themselves, their movements coordinated according to patterns that reflected Segorach's long-term strategies. The masks worn by Harlequins served multiple purposes beyond their obvious role in theatrical performance. Each mask was a sophisticated psychic device that provided protection against chaos corruption, while enabling its wearer to channel specific aspects of the characters they portrayed. The masks incorporated ancient Aeldari psychic technology that had been adapted for use by Segorach's servants, creating items that were both practical tools and sacred artifacts. The most powerful masks could only be worn by individuals who had achieved sufficient spiritual development to handle their psychic resonance without losing their individual identity. The training required to become a Harlequin involved not only the development of performance skills and combat abilities, but also intensive study of Aeldari history, mythology, and the complex symbolic systems that encoded information within their traditional stories. Students learned to perceive the multiple layers of meaning that existed within the ancient tales, understanding how historical events, philosophical principles, and practical knowledge could be preserved and transmitted through carefully structured narratives. The most advanced practitioners could improvise new performances that incorporated current events into the traditional framework, ensuring that the historical record remained current and relevant. The solitaires who walked alone among the Harlequins represented individuals who had chosen to portray Slaanesh within their performances, a role so dangerous that it required complete isolation from their fellow performers to prevent contamination. These solitary figures possessed exceptional mental strength and spiritual purity, enabling them to channel the essence of the Chaos God without succumbing to corruption themselves. The solitaires served as living reminders of the forces that had destroyed their civilization, while providing crucial intelligence about chaos activities throughout the galaxy. The Corsair fleets that roamed the galaxy's void represented another significant group of Aeldari survivors who had chosen a path that differed from both the disciplined exile of the Craftworlds and the predatory lifestyle of the Drukhari. These independent groups consisted of individuals who had rejected the rigid social structures that characterized other survivor communities, preferring the freedom and flexibility that came with a nomadic existence aboard their own vessels. The Corsairs included refugees from various other Aeldari factions, outcasts who had been expelled from their original communities, and adventurers who sought to carve out their own destiny among the stars. The ships used by Corsair fleets incorporated design elements borrowed from both Craftworld and Drukhari traditions, while adapting these technologies to serve the needs of independent operators. The vessels were typically smaller and more maneuverable than Craftworld ships, enabling them to avoid detection and escape from superior forces when necessary. The weapon systems emphasized versatility over specialization, providing the Corsairs with the capability to engage various types of targets while maintaining the option of rapid disengagement if circumstances required retreat. The recruitment practices employed by Corsair fleets reflected their diverse origins and flexible organizational structures. Some fleets actively recruited dissatisfied individuals from Craftworld and Drukhari communities, offering them alternatives to the restrictive lifestyles that characterized these societies. Others grew through the merger of smaller groups that had been forced to cooperate for mutual survival, their combined resources enabling more ambitious operations than any individual group could accomplish alone. The most successful fleets developed reputations that attracted volunteers from across the galaxy, their achievements serving as advertisements for the opportunities available to those willing to embrace the Corsair lifestyle. The activities pursued by Corsair fleets varied widely depending on their leadership, resources, and philosophical orientation. Some groups focused primarily on piracy and raiding, using their superior technology and mobility to prey upon the merchant vessels and poorly defended settlements of younger species. Others served as mercenaries, selling their services to various factions in exchange for resources, information, or safe passage through dangerous regions. A few fleets dedicated themselves to exploration and discovery, seeking out new worlds and phenomena that might provide opportunities for profit or knowledge. The Anwraith, or outcast, represented individuals who had been expelled from Craftworld society for various transgressions against the strict codes of conduct that governed these communities. These exiles found themselves caught between worlds, no longer welcome among their birth communities, but unwilling or unable to embrace the predatory lifestyle of the Drukhari or the independence of the Corsairs. The Anwraith lived as wanderers and outcasts, their existence characterized by constant movement and the perpetual search for acceptance or redemption. The crimes that led to exile from Craftworld society were typically violations of the psychological disciplines that protected these communities from chaos corruption. Individuals who became too obsessed with a particular path, who demonstrated signs of psychological instability, or who engaged in activities that threatened community safety might find themselves declared Anwraith and forced to leave their homes. The exile process was conducted with great ceremony and solemnity, reflecting the gravity of severing an individual's connection to their birth community and the protective systems that sustained Craftworld society. The survival strategies employed by the Anwraith reflected their unique position as individuals who possessed the training and knowledge of Craftworld society, but lacked the community support systems that made such lifestyle sustainable. Many Anwraith became wandering mercenaries or advisors, selling their expertise to other species or factions in exchange for the resources necessary for survival. Others sought to prove their worth through heroic deeds that might eventually earn them readmission to their birth communities or acceptance among other Aeldari survivor groups. The Rangers who had voluntarily left the Craftworld paths represented a different category of outcast, individuals who had chosen exile as a form of spiritual discipline rather than having it imposed upon them as punishment. These wanderers sought to expand their understanding of the galaxy and their own nature through direct experience of the dangers and challenges that existed beyond the protected environment of their birth communities. The Ranger tradition had existed within Craftworld society since the earliest days of their exile, providing a safety valve for individuals whose psychological makeup was incompatible with the restrictions of the path system. The equipment used by Rangers reflected their need for self-sufficiency and stealth during their extended periods of isolation. Their long rifles were precision weapons, capable of eliminating targets at extreme range while remaining undetected, their design incorporating advanced Aeldari technology with practical modifications suited to field conditions. The camouflaging cloaks worn by Rangers provided optical camouflage that could render them nearly invisible to most forms of detection, while their survival gear enabled them to operate independently for extended periods without external support. The intelligence-gathering activities conducted by Rangers provided valuable information to their birth communities while serving the personal development goals that motivated their exile. These wandering scouts observed the activities of various galactic factions, monitored the emergence of new threats, and tracked the movements of enemy forces across multiple star systems. The information they collected was transmitted back to their Craftworld communities through carefully established communication networks that maintained operational security while ensuring that crucial intelligence reached those who could act upon it. The eventual return of Rangers to their birth communities represented the completion of a spiritual journey that had transformed them through exposure to the galaxy's dangers and challenges. The knowledge and experience they brought back with them enriched their communities, while their successful navigation of the exile period demonstrated their psychological resilience and spiritual development. Not all Rangers chose to return to Craftworld society, with some preferring to continue their wandering existence or joining other Aeldari factions that offered different opportunities for service and achievement. The various minor Aeldari factions that existed throughout the galaxy represented adaptations to specific circumstances and opportunities that had emerged in the aftermath of the fall. These groups included trading enclaves that had established themselves on neutral worlds, research communities dedicated to the study of particular phenomena, and military organizations that served specific strategic purposes within the broader context of Aeldari survival. Each of these factions had developed its own culture and traditions while maintaining connections to the broader network of survivor communities. The trading enclaves established on various worlds throughout the galaxy served as intermediaries between different Aeldari factions and the younger species that had emerged to fill the power vacuum left by their empire's collapse. These communities maintained the commercial traditions that had once characterized Aeldari civilization while adapting their practices to the changed circumstances of the post-fall galaxy. The merchants who operated these enclaves possessed detailed knowledge of galactic trade routes, political developments, and economic opportunities that proved valuable to their various clients and partners. The research communities that had established themselves in isolated locations throughout the galaxy continued the scientific traditions that had once driven Aeldari technological development. These groups focused on specific areas of study that were considered too dangerous or controversial for investigation within the more conservative Craftworld communities. Their work included the study of chaos phenomena, the investigation of xenoarchaeology sites, and the development of new technologies that might provide advantages in the ongoing struggle for survival. The interaction between these various survivor groups created a complex network of relationships that transcended the formal boundaries between different factions. Individual Aeldari might move between communities throughout their lifetimes, gaining experience and knowledge that enriched both their personal development and the communities they joined. The exchange of information, resources, and personnel between different groups enabled a level of cooperation and mutual support that helped ensure the survival of their species despite the challenges they faced. The preservation of Aeldari culture and knowledge across these diverse communities required constant effort and careful coordination to prevent the loss of crucial information or the development of incompatible variations in traditional practices. The Harlequins served a crucial role in this preservation effort, their performances providing a common cultural foundation that maintained unity among the scattered survivor populations. The knowledge preserved within the Black Library served as the ultimate repository for information that might otherwise be lost as individual communities faced various threats and challenges. The ongoing evolution of these survivor communities reflected their adaptation to the changing conditions of the galaxy while maintaining their essential Aeldari character. Each group developed its own solutions to the challenges of survival while contributing to the broader effort to preserve their species and culture for future generations. The diversity of approaches and philosophies represented by these communities provided resilience and adaptability that increased the likelihood of long-term survival despite the numerous threats they faced. The catastrophic birth of Slaanesh and the subsequent fall of the Aeldari Empire left an indelible mark upon the galaxy that continues to shape events tens of thousands of years later. The consequences of their civilization's collapse extend far beyond the immediate destruction of worlds and the near extinction of their species, creating ripple effects that have fundamentally altered the nature of reality itself and influenced the development of every subsequent galactic civilization. The Eye of Terror stands as the most visible monument to their failure, a permanent wound in the fabric of space-time that serves as a constant reminder of the dangers inherent in unchecked psychic power and moral decay. The Eye of Terror's creation during the 30th millennium tore a hole in reality that encompasses thousands of star systems, transforming the former heart of the Aeldari Empire into a realm where the laws of physics hold no meaning and time flows according to the whims of chaos entities. This massive warp storm has served as a staging ground for countless demonic incursions into real space, providing the Chaos Gods with a permanent foothold in the material universe that they have exploited to corrupt and destroy civilizations across the galaxy. The Eye's influence extends far beyond its visible boundaries, creating zones of dimensional instability that make space travel dangerous and unpredictable throughout vast regions of the galaxy. The weakening of the barriers between real space and the warp that resulted from the Aeldari's fall has made the galaxy a far more dangerous place for all psychically active species. Where once the Old One's careful engineering had maintained stable boundaries between dimensions, the psychic shockwaves generated by Slaanesh's birth created permanent stress fractures that continue to expand and multiply. These weakened barriers allow warp entities easier access to the material universe, while making psychic activity more dangerous for those who attempt to harness immaterial energies. Human psychers in particular suffer from this degraded dimensional stability, their attempts to use their abilities carrying risks that would have been minimal during the height of Aeldari civilization. The collapse of galactic order that followed the Aeldari Empire's destruction created a power vacuum that took millennia to fill, during which countless worlds fell into barbarism or were consumed by the various threats that emerged from the chaos. The sophisticated trade networks, communication systems, and defensive arrangements that had maintained stability across millions of star systems disappeared virtually overnight, leaving isolated human colonies and other species to fend for themselves against dangers they were ill-equipped to handle. The knowledge and technology that might have enabled these civilizations to maintain their development was lost or became inaccessible, forcing them to rediscover basic principles of science and governance through trial and error. The fragments of Aeldari technology that survived the fall have become objects of intense interest and study for the younger species that have emerged to prominence in the post-fall galaxy. The Imperium of Man, despite its general xenophobia and suspicion of alien artifacts, has made extensive efforts to understand and exploit Aeldari technological principles, particularly those related to webway construction and psychic manipulation. Imperial tech priests have spent millennia attempting to reverse engineer wraithbone construction techniques, psychic amplification systems, and dimensional engineering principles, achieving limited success that has nonetheless contributed to several crucial Imperial technologies. The webway network itself, though severely damaged by the catastrophic events surrounding Slaanesh's birth, remains partially functional and continues to influence galactic events through the activities of those who can access its passages. The Emperor of Mankind's own attempts to create an Imperial webway during the Great Crusade demonstrated both the potential value of this technology and the dangers inherent in its construction. The failure of the Imperial webway project, precipitated by Magnus, the Red's psychic breach of the barriers protecting Terra, resulted in the creation of another permanent warp rift that required the Emperor's constant attention to contain, effectively removing him from active participation in Imperial governance. The surviving Aeldari factions continue to utilize the remaining webway passages for their own purposes, their superior knowledge of the network's operation giving them significant strategic advantages over younger species who must rely on conventional warp travel. The Craftworld Aeldari use these passages to coordinate their activities across vast distances while avoiding the worst dangers of warp travel, their Farseer's prescient abilities enabling them to navigate routes that would be suicidal for less gifted travelers. The Drukhari of Camorra have transformed portions of the network into hunting grounds and slave routes, their intimate knowledge of hidden passages allowing them to strike at targets throughout the galaxy before disappearing back into the dimensional labyrinth. The ruins of Aeldari worlds scattered throughout the galaxy have become sources of both valuable artifacts and terrible corruption for those brave or foolish enough to explore them. Many of these worlds were transformed into demon worlds during the Eye of Terror's formation, their wraithbone cities twisted into nightmarish parodies of their former beauty that serve as lairs for chaos entities and cultists. Others remain physically intact, but are saturated with psychic residue from the events that destroyed their populations, creating environments where reality remains unstable, and the boundaries between material and immaterial existence are dangerously thin. Imperial explorator fleets and rogue trader expeditions regularly attempt to salvage useful technology from these ruins, despite the extreme dangers involved in such operations. The wraithbone constructions that form the basis of Aeldari architecture resist conventional demolition techniques while retaining psychic resonance patterns that can drive unprepared minds to madness or corruption. Chaos cults have established hidden bases within some of these ruins, using the residual psychic energies to power their rituals while remaining hidden from Imperial detection. The most dangerous sites require specialized Inquisition teams equipped with psychic wards and demon hunting equipment to investigate safely. The prophetic role that modern Aeldari play in galactic events reflects their species' unique relationship with time and causality, their prescient abilities enabling them to perceive potential futures and manipulate events to serve their long-term survival goals. The Craftworld Farseers regularly intervene in conflicts that might seem unrelated to their immediate interests, their actions guided by visions of possible futures that reveal the ultimate consequences of current events. These interventions often appear mysterious or counterproductive to other species, but they serve the Aeldari's broader strategy of preventing outcomes that would lead to their final extinction. The manipulation of other species by Aeldari seers has become a constant factor in galactic politics, their subtle influence shaping the development of civilizations and the outcomes of conflicts across thousands of star systems. Imperial commanders have learned to be suspicious of seemingly fortunate coincidences and unexpected allies, recognizing that Aeldari manipulation often lies behind events that appear to favor human interests. The Aeldari's willingness to sacrifice millions of human lives to preserve a single member of their own species reflects their understanding of their precarious position as a dying race whose survival depends on careful resource management and strategic planning. The Inari movement that emerged in recent millennia represents the most significant development in Aeldari society since the fall, offering the possibility of genuine redemption and revival for their dying species. The awakening of Ennead, the Aeldari god of the dead, has been prophesied since the earliest days following their civilization's collapse, with seers predicting that this deity's birth would provide the power necessary to defeat Slaanesh and free the souls of their people from eternal torment. The formation of the Inari faction, which draws members from all surviving Aeldari groups, demonstrates their species' desperate hope for salvation and their willingness to set aside ancient rivalries in pursuit of this ultimate goal. The prophecies surrounding Ennead's awakening describe a process that requires the death of entire Craftworld populations to provide sufficient psychic energy for the god's birth, creating a terrible dilemma for the Aeldari leadership, who must choose between preserving their current communities and gambling everything on an uncertain chance of species-wide resurrection. The Inari's interpretation of these prophecies suggests that voluntary sacrifice by the Aeldari themselves, rather than the gradual accumulation of souls over millennia, might accelerate Ennead's awakening and provide their species with the power to reclaim their former glory. The potential consequences of Ennead's full awakening extend far beyond the Aeldari themselves, as the birth of a new god of death would fundamentally alter the balance of power within the warp and potentially provide other species with new weapons against chaos corruption. The conflict between Ennead and Slaanesh that would inevitably follow such an awakening could tear new holes in reality while simultaneously healing some of the damage caused by the original fall. The ultimate outcome of this divine conflict remains uncertain, with some seers predicting triumph and renewal, while others foresee only greater destruction and chaos. The technological legacy of the Aeldari Empire continues to influence galactic development through the artifacts and knowledge that survive in various forms throughout the galaxy. The Imperium's attempts to understand and replicate Aeldari technology have led to the development of several crucial systems, including improved psychic detection equipment, enhanced force field generators, and more efficient plasma weapon designs. However, the fundamental principles underlying the most advanced Aeldari technologies remain beyond Imperial comprehension. Their integration of psychic manipulation with physical engineering, requiring insights that human science has yet to achieve. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains extensive archives of Aeldari technological data gathered from millennia of study and reverse engineering efforts, though much of this information remains classified at the highest levels due to concerns about chaos corruption and technological heresy. Tech priests who specialize in xenotechnology study have made significant contributions to Imperial military capabilities through their analysis of captured Aeldari weapons and equipment, though their work is constantly monitored by the Inquisition to prevent the spread of dangerous knowledge or corrupting influences. The influence of Aeldari aesthetic principles can be seen in various aspects of Imperial culture, particularly in the architecture and artistic traditions of worlds that were once part of their empire or had significant contact with their civilization before the fall. The flowing organic forms that characterized Aeldari design continue to appear in human artistic works, while the mathematical principles underlying their architectural achievements have influenced the construction of some Imperial installations. However, these influences are often subtle and unconscious, as direct emulation of Xeno's artistic traditions would be considered heretical by Imperial authorities. The ongoing survival of the Aeldari species depends on their ability to adapt to the changed conditions of the 41st millennium while maintaining the essential characteristics that define their nature and culture. The various survivor factions have developed different approaches to this challenge, from the rigid discipline of the Craftworld paths to the predatory opportunism of the Drukhari and the mystical guidance provided by the Harlequins. Each approach offers certain advantages while creating specific vulnerabilities, their diversity providing resilience that increases the species' overall chances of long-term survival. The relationship between the different Aeldari factions remains complex and often antagonistic, their shared heritage balanced against fundamental disagreements about philosophy, methodology, and ultimate goals. The Craftworld Aeldari view their Drukhari cousins with disgust and horror, seeing them as examples of what their species might have become if they had not embraced the discipline of the path system. The Drukhari regard the Craftworld inhabitants as weak and deluded, their rigid self-control preventing them from embracing the power and freedom that comes with accepting their true nature. Despite these philosophical differences, practical necessity sometimes forces cooperation between different Aeldari factions when faced with threats that endanger their entire species. The emergence of chaos incursions, Tyranid hive fleets, or Necron tomb worlds can unite Craftworld and Drukhari forces in temporary alliances that demonstrate their shared commitment to Aeldari survival despite their divergent approaches to achieving that goal. These collaborations are typically brief and limited in scope, dissolving once the immediate threat has been addressed, and the factions return to their normal patterns of mutual suspicion and occasional conflict. The preservation of Aeldari culture and knowledge across the scattered survivor communities requires constant effort and careful coordination to prevent the loss of crucial information or the development of incompatible variations in traditional practices. The Harlequins serve a crucial role in this preservation effort, their performances providing a common cultural foundation that maintains unity among the scattered survivor populations, while ensuring that important historical lessons are not forgotten. The knowledge preserved within the Black Library serves as the ultimate repository for information that might otherwise be lost as individual communities face various threats and challenges. The future of the Aeldari species remains uncertain, their survival dependent on factors that extend far beyond their own actions and decisions. The ongoing expansion of chaos influence throughout the galaxy threatens all psychically active species, while the awakening of ancient Necron dynasties and the approach of Tyranid hive fleets create existential threats that could eliminate the Aeldari entirely regardless of their own efforts to preserve their civilization. The potential awakening of Ennead offers hope for genuine revival and redemption, but the risks associated with this process could just as easily result in their final extinction. The lessons provided by the Aeldaris serve as warnings for other species that possess significant psychic potential, demonstrating the dangers inherent in unchecked power and moral decay. The Imperium of Man has taken these lessons to heart in its approach to psyker management and chaos corruption, though whether human civilization can avoid the same fate that befell the Aeldari remains to be seen. The rigid controls and brutal suppression methods employed by Imperial authorities represent one approach to preventing psychic corruption, but their effectiveness in the long term remains unproven. The Aeldari Empire's legacy extends beyond mere technological artifacts or cautionary tales to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of reality itself that continue to influence galactic events. The weakened barriers between dimensions, the permanent warp storms that scar the galaxy, and the ongoing activities of chaos entities all trace their origins to the catastrophic events of the Fall. The galaxy of the 41st millennium remains shaped by the consequences of Aeldari hubris, their civilization's collapse serving as the defining event that created the dark and dangerous universe in which all current species must struggle to survive. As the galaxy moves deeper into the 42nd millennium, the scattered remnants of the once mighty Aeldari continue their desperate struggle for survival against impossible odds. Their ancient wisdom and advanced technology provide them with advantages that enable them to punch above their weight in galactic affairs, but their numerical weakness and the constant threat of extinction limit their ability to influence events on the scale their ancestors once commanded. whether they will ultimately achieve redemption through Ennead's awakening, fade into extinction despite their best efforts, or find some other path to survival remains one of the great uncertainties of the current age. The story of the Aeldari Empire thus serves as both a monument to the heights that civilization can achieve and a warning about the depths to which it can fall. Their rise from the ashes of the war in heaven to galactic dominance demonstrated the potential that exists within all intelligent species, while their subsequent corruption and near extinction revealed the eternal vigilance required to maintain civilization against the forces of decay and chaos. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Aeldari's struggle continues as a reminder that even the mightiest empires can fall, but that hope for redemption may persist even in the darkest of times.